Eve, the mother of humanity. Before the first dawn touched the untouched face of the earth, silence ruled beneath the endless heavens like an ancient kingdom without walls. Darkness stretched across the waters in slow-moving shadows, vast and immeasurable, while invisible winds drifted over the deep with the weight of eternity itself. The stars had not yet learned to burn. Mountains slept unborn beneath the abyss. No bird pierced the skies with song, no river carved its silver path through stone, and no human breath disturbed the sacred stillness of creation. Then, through the endless void, the voice of God moved like thunder wrapped in light, ancient beyond understanding, powerful enough to awaken worlds from nothingness. Light burst across the heavens in radiant waves, spilling over the waters like molten gold, and the darkness recoiled into the distant corners of the universe. Day and night were divided. Oceans gathered beneath towering cliffs. Forests rose from the soil with trembling leaves glistening beneath newborn sunlight. The world unfolded slowly, beautifully, as though painted by divine hands across the canvas of eternity. Rivers flowed through untouched valleys. Mist drifted above quiet meadows where flowers opened beneath the morning warmth. In the center of this living paradise stood Eden, hidden beneath towering trees and guarded by sacred peace. Waterfalls thundered softly beyond emerald hills while warm winds carried the scent of earth, rain, and flowering branches through the garden paths. Every living creature moved in perfect harmony beneath the gaze of heaven. Yet even within the beauty of creation, a profound stillness remained, as though the world itself waited for someone yet to come. Morning light spilled across the eastern horizon of Eden, casting golden reflections upon rivers that wound through the garden like streams of polished crystal. Dew clung to every blade of grass, while distant waterfalls echoed through the valleys beneath towering cedars and fig trees heavy with fruit. Lions wandered peacefully beside grazing deer. Birds with feathers brighter than gemstones crossed the open skies in slow circles above the untouched earth. Yet among all living things, there remained no creature capable of carrying the image of the Creator himself. Then the Lord descended into the stillness of the garden, and the winds grew quiet beneath his presence. Dust swirled gently across the ground as divine hands reached toward the soil from which mankind would rise. The earth trembled softly beneath the weight of sacred purpose. From clay and breath, from earth and eternity intertwined together, Adam was formed beneath the canopy of Eden. His body rested motionless upon the ground, while silence covered the garden like a veil. Then came the breath of God, flowing into him like fire carried upon invisible wind. Adam's chest rose sharply. His eyes opened beneath the first light of morning, reflecting the rivers, trees, and heavens above him. He drew his first breath as the living soul of humanity awakened beneath the gaze of creation itself. The garden stirred around him. Leaves rustled softly overhead, while sunlight moved across the hills in radiant waves. Adam stood barefoot upon the sacred earth, feeling cool soil beneath his feet and warm wind across his skin. Wonder filled his eyes as he gazed upon the vast beauty surrounding him. Every sound carried meaning. Every movement seemed alive with divine intention. Yet beyond the majesty of Eden, unseen by Adam's innocent eyes, destiny itself had already begun its slow and irreversible march through eternity. Days passed within Eden like flowing rivers untouched by sorrow or fear. Adam wandered beneath towering trees whose branches stretched toward heaven like living pillars crowned in emerald light. He walked beside crystal waters where fish glimmered beneath the surface like moving silver beneath the sun. The garden breathed with life around him. Every creature approached without fear, drawn toward the peace carried within the first man. Great elephants crossed the open fields with slow and thunderous steps, while birds rested upon Adam's shoulders beneath the warmth of afternoon sunlight. He named each living creature with quiet authority, his voice echoing gently through the valleys and forests of paradise. Yet with every passing day, another feeling slowly awakened within him, subtle as distant thunder beyond the horizon. Though surrounded by beauty beyond imagination, Adam remained alone. At twilight, he often stood beside the rivers of Eden, watching golden light fade across the waters while cool evening winds moved softly through the trees. The laughter of flowing streams and the songs of birds could not silence the growing emptiness within his spirit. Every creature possessed another of its kind. The wolves moved in pairs beneath the moonlight. The birds crossed the heavens together against the crimson skies of sunset. Yet Adam walked the garden alone beneath the stars. The silence beside him became heavier with each passing evening. God watched the loneliness growing quietly within the heart of mankind, and heaven itself seemed to pause in solemn understanding. One night, beneath a sky overflowing with endless constellations, Adam rested upon the grass near the heart of Eden, while silver moonlight covered the garden like sacred fire. The wind slowed. The rivers softened their endless songs. A holy stillness descended upon creation itself as the Lord prepared to reveal a mystery hidden since the foundation of the world. The night air carried the fragrance of rain and flowering trees as Adam slept beneath the ancient branches near the center of Eden. Moonlight poured across the garden in pale rivers of silver, illuminating the soft mist drifting above the ground, while distant waterfalls echoed like whispers from another world. All creation seemed suspended within sacred silence. Even the winds moving through the leaves had grown still beneath the presence of God. Then the Creator approached the sleeping man, and the earth itself trembled with quiet reverence. From Adam's side, beneath divine hands untouched by imperfection, the first woman was formed. Bone and flesh became living beauty beneath the breath of heaven. Slowly her eyes opened to the light of creation, reflecting the stars above her like mirrors of eternity itself. Eve stood within Eden for the first time, surrounded by glowing rivers, towering gardens, and the endless songs of living creatures awakening beneath the dawn. Her hair moved softly in the morning wind while sunlight spilled across her face like gold descending from heaven. Adam awoke as the first rays of sunrise crossed the hills of paradise. He looked upon Eve, and something within him awakened deeper than language itself. Wonder, love, and recognition filled his eyes as though his soul had finally discovered what it had searched for since the moment of creation. The garden seemed brighter around them. Birds crossed the skies in radiant swarms while warm light danced across the flowing rivers beside them. Adam spoke with trembling awe, calling her woman because she had been taken from man. Together they walked through Eden beneath endless beauty untouched by suffering or death. Their laughter echoed beside waterfalls and open meadows where flowers bowed gently beneath the wind. For the first time since the foundation of the world, humanity stood complete beneath the gaze of God, innocent and unashamed within the paradise prepared for them since the dawn of creation. Seasons did not wound Eden with decay, for the garden existed untouched by death beneath the blessing of heaven. Morning sunlight filtered through vast canopies of fig and olive trees, while rivers flowed endlessly across stones polished smooth by eternal waters. Adam and Eve walked together through valleys filled with wildflowers that swayed gently beneath warm winds scented with rain and cedar. Every living creature moved peacefully beside them. Lions rested beneath shaded groves while gazelles crossed the open fields in graceful silence. The world itself seemed to breathe in harmony around the first man and woman. At dusk, they often stood beside the great river flowing from the heart of Eden, watching the sky burn with crimson and gold as stars slowly awakened across the heavens above. Their voices carried softly through the garden, untouched by fear, shame, or sorrow. They knew only innocence, only trust in the Creator who walked among them within the cool evening air. Yet within the vast beauty of paradise stood one sacred boundary beneath the shadow of ancient trees. At the center of the garden grew the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, its branches stretching high above the earth like dark arms reaching toward heaven itself. The fruit shimmered beneath the sunlight with strange and terrible beauty. God had spoken clearly to Adam, warning that death would enter the world if they ate from the forbidden tree. The command rested upon them not as cruelty, but as sacred trust between Creator and creation. Still, beyond the visible peace of Eden, another presence watched from the shadows beyond human sight. Far older than mankind, consumed by pride and rebellion, the fallen serpent moved silently through the darkness of the unseen world. As Adam and Eve wandered joyfully through paradise beneath golden skies, unseen eyes followed them from the depths of envy and hatred. The peace of Eden remained unbroken for now, but beneath the surface of creation itself, the first shadow of humanity's coming sorrow had already begun to rise. Twilight descended slowly upon Eden, covering the garden in amber light, while cool winds drifted through the trees carrying the scent of earth and distant rain. Adam gathered fruit beside the rivers while Eve wandered near the center of the garden, where ancient branches stretched across the heavens like woven shadows. Birds settled quietly into the trees above her as the last warmth of sunlight faded behind the western hills. Then, from the silence beneath the leaves, a voice emerged soft as flowing water, yet cold beneath its beauty. The serpent appeared among the branches of the forbidden tree, its scales glimmering like polished bronze beneath the fading light. Its eyes burned with ancient intelligence far older than mankind itself. Eve paused beside the tree while the winds around her seemed suddenly still. The serpent spoke carefully, twisting truth with subtle poison, questioning the command given by God. Its words moved slowly through the air like invisible smoke, planting doubt where only trust had once existed. Eve looked upon the fruit hanging above her, radiant beneath the dimming sky, beautiful beyond ordinary understanding. The garden around her remained peaceful, yet an unseen tension pressed against the silence like distant thunder before a storm. She remembered the voice of God, the warning spoken within the sacred peace of Eden, but the serpent continued whispering promises of wisdom, power, and enlightenment beyond human limits. The forbidden fruit seemed to glow within the growing darkness as though creation itself held its breath. Far away, Adam's footsteps echoed faintly beside the riverbanks while evening shadows stretched across the garden floor. Eve reached slowly toward the branch above her, her fingers trembling within the cold stillness surrounding the tree. In that single moment, beneath the fading light of paradise, humanity stood at the edge of irreversible destiny. The heavens remained silent. The wind ceased moving through the trees. Even the creatures of Eden seemed to retreat into fearful quiet as the first act of rebellion approached like a shadow consuming the final light of innocence. Eve's fingers closed around the forbidden fruit while silence engulfed the garden with terrifying stillness. The air itself seemed heavier as she lifted the fruit toward her face, its surface gleaming beneath the dim twilight, like fire hidden beneath crimson skin. For a moment she hesitated, hearing only the distant sound of flowing water beyond the trees and the faint beating of her own heart within the silence. Then she ate. The first bite shattered the sacred innocence of Eden like glass breaking beneath unseen force. A cold awareness surged through her spirit, sudden and overwhelming. The warmth of paradise seemed to withdraw from the world around her. Shadows deepened beneath the trees. The winds turned restless. Leaves trembled overhead, though no storm crossed the skies. Eve stood frozen beneath the forbidden branches, fear rising slowly within her chest like icy water. Soon Adam approached through the fading light, carrying fruit gathered from the garden fields. His footsteps slowed as he looked upon Eve's face, sensing something had changed within the stillness surrounding her. The serpent remained hidden among the shadows, watching in silence as Eve offered the fruit to the man beside her. Adam's eyes lingered upon the forbidden tree while the warning of God echoed within his memory like distant thunder. Yet love for Eve overcame obedience within his heart. He took the fruit into his hands and ate beside her beneath the darkening heavens. In that instant the world changed. Innocence vanished like mist beneath scorching fire. Shame entered humanity for the first time. Adam and Eve looked upon themselves with fearful understanding, suddenly aware of their nakedness beneath the gaze of creation. The garden that once radiated peace now felt unfamiliar and terrifying. Cold wind moved violently through the trees while distant thunder rolled across the horizon beyond Eden. Trembling with fear, they gathered leaves to cover themselves and fled among the shadows of the forest. Night descended heavily upon paradise as mankind hid from the Creator whose presence had once filled them with perfect joy. Darkness spread across Eden beneath gathering clouds while cold winds swept through the trees with mournful whispers. Adam and Eve hid among tangled branches deep within the garden, their breathing uneven as fear consumed the peace they had once known. Leaves trembled violently around them, while distant thunder echoed across the hills like judgment approaching from beyond the heavens. The rivers of Eden still flowed beside them, but their songs no longer brought comfort. Every shadow now seemed filled with terror. Every sound within the garden carried the weight of guilt pressing upon their hearts. Then through the darkness came the voice of God walking within the garden during the cool of evening, the same voice that once brought only joy and safety. Yet now Adam and Eve shrank deeper into the shadows, unable to stand openly before the Creator they had betrayed. God called out to Adam, not because heaven lacked knowledge, but because humanity had already begun separating itself from divine presence through fear and disobedience. Trembling beneath the trees, Adam finally answered, his voice broken with shame as he confessed that he had hidden because he was naked. The question that followed pierced through the silence of Eden with devastating sorrow. Who told you that you were naked? The truth unfolded slowly beneath the storm-darkened skies. Adam blamed Eve. Eve blamed the serpent. The harmony of creation fractured beneath the burden of sin entering the world for the first time. Then came judgment spoken with grief greater than human understanding. The serpent was cursed above all creatures. Pain and sorrow would follow humanity through every generation. The ground itself would resist mankind with thorns, hardship, and sweat. Death, once unknown within paradise, would now claim every living body born upon the earth. Rain began falling softly through the trees while Adam and Eve stood trembling beneath the voice of God. The beauty of Eden remained around them, but innocence had vanished forever. Humanity had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, and all creation now carried the scars of that single terrible choice. Rain fell steadily across Eden as dawn struggled to rise behind heavy clouds hanging over the garden. Water dripped from the leaves in slow silver streams while cold mist covered the valleys where Adam and Eve once walked in perfect joy beside their Creator. Now sorrow followed every step they took through the paradise that no longer felt like home. Their eyes carried exhaustion and grief far deeper than the passing storm surrounding them. The warmth of innocence had disappeared from their spirits, replaced by shame, fear, and the crushing knowledge of mortality. Adam looked upon the soil beneath his feet and understood for the first time that one day his body would return to the dust from which he had been formed. Eve wept quietly beside the rivers of Eden while distant thunder faded beyond the eastern hills. Yet even within judgment, the mercy of God remained present. The Lord clothed Adam and Eve with garments made from living creatures, revealing the first shadow of sacrifice entering human history. Blood touched the earth for the first time beneath the sorrowful skies of paradise. The cost of rebellion now stained creation itself. Then the moment came that would forever divide humanity from Eden. At the entrance of the garden, beneath towering trees trembling in the morning wind, angels appeared carrying flaming swords blazing with heavenly fire. Their presence illuminated the storm-darkened landscape with terrifying majesty. Adam and Eve stood frozen before the gates of paradise while tears streamed down their faces. Behind them lay the rivers, forests, and endless beauty they would never again call home. Before them stretched the unknown wilderness of a fallen world. Slowly they walked away from Eden beneath cold rain and darkened skies, their footsteps fading into the silence beyond the sacred garden. Behind them the flaming swords burned against the horizon like stars of judgment, guarding the path back to innocence forever lost. Humanity's first exile had begun, and the sorrow of that departure would echo through every generation born upon the earth thereafter. Beyond the borders of Eden, the world felt harsher beneath gray skies untouched by the perfect peace of paradise. Jagged rocks covered the hillsides while bitter winds swept across empty plains carrying dust through the cold morning air. Adam and Eve walked slowly through the wilderness wrapped in garments heavy with rain and sorrow. Behind them, far beyond the distant horizon, the flaming light guarding Eden still glowed faintly against the heavens like a memory fading into eternity. Every step carried them farther from the life they once knew beneath the presence of God. The earth no longer yielded effortlessly beneath their hands. Adam labored beneath the scorching sun, breaking hardened ground with bleeding fingers while sweat ran across his face into the dust below. Thorns tore against his skin. Harsh winds battered the fields he struggled to cultivate. Eve watched the changing seasons pass beneath skies now marked by storms, decay, and death. Yet even within suffering, the memory of Eden remained alive within them like an aching wound carried deep inside the soul. At night, they often sat beside flickering firelight listening to distant wolves cry beneath the darkness, while stars stretched endlessly above the wilderness. They remembered the rivers of paradise, the warmth of divine presence walking beside them in the cool evening air, and the innocence forever lost beneath the forbidden tree. Time moved forward like an unstoppable river. Wrinkles slowly touched their faces. Weariness settled into their bodies. Humanity's long journey through pain, hope, rebellion, and redemption had begun with them. Yet hidden even within the sorrow of exile remained a promise spoken quietly by God amid judgment, a future hope that one day the power of evil would be crushed and the separation between heaven and mankind would not endure forever. As the fire beside Adam and Eve flickered beneath the endless night sky, the first chapter of humanity closed not with triumph, but with longing, a longing for restoration, forgiveness, and the lost piece of Eden that would echo through the heart of every generation yet to come. Years passed beyond Eden beneath skies that no longer sheltered humanity from suffering. Seasons changed across the wilderness with relentless rhythm as scorching summers gave way to bitter winters filled with cold rain and merciless winds. Adam and Eve built their lives upon unforgiving soil where every harvest demanded pain, endurance, and sweat. The once gentle earth resisted them now with stones, thorns, and hardened ground that tore at their hands beneath the burning sun. Yet amid hardship, life continued unfolding through the mysterious mercy of God. Eve carried within her the first children born into the fallen world, and when Cain entered the earth beneath cries echoing through the night, Adam looked upon his son with trembling wonder mixed with sorrow. The firelight flickered across Eve's exhausted face, while distant thunder rolled beyond the mountains. Soon after came Abel, gentle and quiet beneath the shadow of his older brother. Their laughter slowly filled the wilderness camp where silence and grief had once ruled alone. Adam taught his sons how to shape tools from stone and wood, while Eve spoke softly of Eden beside evening fires burning against the darkness. The children listened wide-eyed to stories of rivers flowing through paradise and trees heavy with endless fruit beneath skies untouched by death. Yet they could never fully understand the world their parents had lost. For them, pain and struggle were the only realities they had ever known. Cain grew strong beneath the burden of the fields, his hands hardened by soil and labor. Abel wandered among the flocks beneath open skies, guiding sheep through valleys covered in morning mist. Though both brothers walked beneath the same heavens, different spirits stirred within them. Adam often watched his sons from the doorway of their shelter while cold winds swept across the plains, sensing an invisible tension slowly growing between them like gathering storm clouds before unseen disaster. The sorrow that entered humanity through Eden had not vanished. It had merely begun extending its shadow into the hearts of the next generation. The wilderness awoke beneath pale dawn light as Cain worked the hardened earth with determined strength. Dust clung to his skin while sweat rolled down his face beneath the rising heat of the morning sun. Across distant hills, Abel guided his flock beside quiet streams where soft grass bent beneath the wind. The brothers lived beneath the same skies, yet carried different spirits within their hearts. Abel moved with humility and peace, often lifting his eyes toward the heavens with silent gratitude for the Creator who still watched over humanity despite its exile. Cain, however, carried a restless fire within him, hidden beneath years of labor and silent frustration. As time passed, the moment came when both brothers brought offerings before God. Abel selected the finest among his flock, placing the sacrifice upon the altar with reverence and sincere devotion. Smoke rose into the evening sky while golden light from the setting sun flickered across the stones beneath him. Cain also brought an offering from the fruit of the ground he had worked so tirelessly to cultivate. Yet within his heart resentment lingered like poison buried beneath the surface. The Lord accepted Abel's sacrifice, but Cain's offering found no favor before heaven. The silence that followed felt heavier than thunder across the wilderness. Cain's face darkened beneath rising anger while shadows stretched across the earth around him. God spoke gently, warning him that sin crouched at the door of his heart like a predator waiting to consume him. But Cain turned away from the warning, allowing bitterness to grow stronger within him with each passing day. One morning beneath gray skies heavy with distant rain, Cain led Abel into the open fields beyond their home. Wind moved through the tall grass while silence covered the earth around them. Then violence shattered the stillness of creation. The first murder stained the ground beneath human hands as Cain struck down his brother in the wilderness. Abel's blood soaked into the earth while the heavens remained silent above the broken world. Far away, Eve's cries echoed through the camp when the truth emerged beneath the darkening sky. Humanity had not only lost Eden, it had now learned how to destroy itself. Night settled heavily across the wilderness after Abel's death, and a deep sorrow consumed the dwelling of Adam and Eve like an endless shadow. Rain fell softly upon the earth where Abel's blood had been spilled, sinking into the soil that had already been cursed since Eden. Eve sat beside the fading firelight with tears upon her face, mourning the son whose gentle spirit had once brought peace into their broken world. Adam stood silently beyond the shelter, staring into the darkness where distant winds moved across the empty plains. The grief within him was heavier than any burden carried by mortal hands. He remembered the perfect harmony of Eden and understood now how far humanity had fallen from the innocence once given by God. Cain wandered alone beneath the judgment placed upon him, marked forever by the consequences of his violence. The earth itself seemed colder after Abel's death. Wolves cried through the night, while bitter winds swept across the valleys carrying dust through the barren wilderness. Yet even amid unimaginable sorrow, life continued moving forward beneath the mysterious design of heaven. Eve bore another son named Seth, and hope slowly returned like the first faint light after endless darkness. Seth grew beneath the teachings of Adam, learning the sacred stories of creation, Eden, and the mercy that still endured despite mankind's rebellion. Around evening fires, Adam spoke to his children and grandchildren of rivers that shimmered like crystal beneath paradise sunlight, and of the voice of God walking among humanity before fear entered the world. The younger generations listened with silent wonder while sparks drifted upward into the night sky, filled with endless stars. Though they had never seen Eden, longing for it lived deep within their spirits like an ancient memory carried through blood and soul alike. As years became decades and decades became centuries, humanity multiplied across the earth. Camps became settlements. Families spread across valleys, rivers, and distant mountains. Yet alongside human growth came increasing darkness within the hearts of mankind. Violence spread through the generations like wildfire across dry fields. Pride, greed, and corruption slowly consumed the earth, and heaven watched as humanity drifted farther from the sacred purpose for which it had first been created. Generations rose and faded beneath the passing centuries while the earth groaned beneath the growing weight of human corruption. Great settlements emerged beside rivers and fertile plains where fires burned through the night and voices echoed beneath towering stone structures built by human ambition. Men forged weapons from iron and bronze while violence spread across the land like disease carried upon the wind. The cries of the innocent rose into the heavens as pride hardened the hearts of mankind. What began in Eden through one act of disobedience had now become a flood of wickedness, consuming entire generations. Adam lived long enough to witness humanity drifting farther from the Creator with every passing century. His eyes, once filled with wonder beneath the beauty of paradise, now carried the sorrow of one who had watched innocence die before his very gaze. Often he climbed alone to quiet hills at dusk where cold winds moved through the grass beneath fading sunlight. There he remembered Eden. He remembered rivers untouched by bloodshed, skies unbroken by storms, and evenings when God walked beside humanity without fear or separation. Those memories haunted him like fragments of a lost world beyond reach. Eventually death came to Adam, the very judgment first spoken beneath the forbidden tree. His final breath left him beneath a sky crowded with silent stars, while generations of children surrounded the dying patriarch. Dust returned to dust, just as God had warned long ago within paradise. Eve mourned beside him with tears shaped by centuries of suffering, knowing the man formed by the breath of God had now fallen beneath the power of mortality. Yet even after Adam's death, the world continued spiraling deeper into darkness. Kingdoms rose through violence. Men exalted themselves above heaven. Blood stained the soil across the earth. Still, among the corruption, a small number remained faithful to the Creator, carrying the ancient hope passed down from the days before exile. Among them was a man named Noah, born into a world trembling beneath approaching judgment. Far above humanity's rebellion, storm clouds were already gathering across the unseen heavens, and the patience of God moved steadily toward a moment that would shake the foundations of the entire earth. The earth had become filled with corruption beneath the eyes of heaven. Violence echoed through cities built by human pride, while greed and cruelty spread across nations like shadows swallowing the final traces of light. Men no longer sought the Creator who had formed them from the dust. Instead, they worshipped their own power, raising monuments to themselves beneath skies darkened by smoke and bloodshed. Children grew among hatred and fear, while the cries of suffering rose endlessly from the valleys of the earth. Yet amid the growing darkness, Noah walked differently from the world around him. He lived with quiet obedience beneath the gaze of God, while storms gathered unseen beyond the horizon of history. Noah often stood beneath the evening sky beside the fields he cultivated, listening to distant thunder rolling across the mountains while cold winds swept through the trees. He remembered the ancient stories passed down from Adam through generations long buried beneath the earth, stories of Eden, of innocence lost, and of humanity's separation from divine presence. Then the voice of God came to Noah with terrifying clarity, declaring that judgment would fall upon the earth through a flood unlike anything creation had ever witnessed. The heavens themselves would open. Waters would rise above mountains. Every living thing outside God's mercy would perish beneath the waves. Noah was commanded to build an ark, a vessel vast enough to preserve life through the coming destruction. Day after day he labored beneath scorching sun and bitter rain while the world around him mocked his obedience. Great beams of wood rose slowly against the skyline, while hammers echoed through the valleys. People laughed at the old man building a massive ship far from any sea, blind to the judgment approaching them like a storm concealed beyond distant clouds. Years passed as the ark continued growing beneath the open heavens. Animals began gathering from across the earth, moving silently toward the vessel under mysterious guidance beyond human understanding. Strange tension filled the air. Winds grew restless. Dark clouds often lingered upon the horizon longer than before. Yet humanity continued celebrating, fighting, and corrupting itself beneath skies that would soon unleash unimaginable destruction upon the world. The final days before the flood arrived beneath skies heavy with unnatural stillness. Birds circled restlessly above the valleys while cold winds swept through the settlements of mankind, carrying dust across crowded streets and towering stone halls. Yet humanity remained blind to the judgment standing at its doorstep. Laughter echoed through feasts lit by firelight, while merchants traded goods beneath marketplaces crowded with noise and celebration. The people mocked Noah openly as he completed the enormous ark rising above the plains like a dark mountain of wood beneath the heavens. For decades he had warned them of coming destruction, but their hearts had grown too hardened to hear truth any longer. Then the appointed day arrived. The air itself felt strange, thick with tension beneath darkening clouds gathering across the sky. Noah led his family into the ark while animals entered in solemn procession, their footsteps echoing through the wooden chambers of the vessel. Lions, birds, elephants, and countless living creatures disappeared inside as though guided by invisible hands. Outside, humanity watched with confusion and ridicule, unaware they were witnessing the final moments of the world they had known. Then the door of the ark closed with thunderous finality. Silence covered the earth. Even the winds seemed to stop breathing for one dreadful moment. Suddenly the heavens erupted. Rain crashed downward with unimaginable force while the fountains of the deep burst open beneath the earth itself. Water exploded from the ground in violent torrents as lightning split the sky above terrified cities and fleeing crowds. Rivers overflowed instantly. Valleys vanished beneath rising floods. People screamed as the waters consumed homes, temples, and kingdoms alike. The storm raged without mercy. Mountains disappeared beneath endless waves while the ark rose upon the violent waters like the last fragment of hope remaining in a dying world. Inside the vessel, Noah listened to the roar of destruction beyond the wooden walls while lanterns flickered against trembling beams. Outside, humanity vanished beneath the judgment of the flood. The earth that once carried the beauty of Eden had now become an endless sea beneath blackened skies and relentless rain that fell without ceasing across the face of creation. For 40 days and 40 nights the storm consumed the world beneath relentless darkness. Thunder rolled endlessly across the heavens while towering waves crashed against the ark with terrifying force. Inside the vessel, lanterns swayed violently from wooden beams as Noah and his family listened to the roar of destruction surrounding them on every side. The cries of the outside world had long faded beneath the floodwaters. Now only endless rain and the groaning of the ark remained. Water stretched across the earth without boundary, swallowing mountains, forests, and cities beneath a vast and lifeless sea. The world that descended from Adam had vanished beneath divine judgment. Yet within the darkness floated the fragile promise of humanity's survival. Noah often stood near the narrow openings of the ark, watching flashes of lightning illuminate the endless waters beyond. He thought of generations lost beneath the flood and of the ancient stories carried down from Eden itself. Somewhere beneath those violent waves rested the graves of countless lives consumed by corruption and rebellion. Eventually the rains ceased, but the waters remained covering the earth for many months beneath silent gray skies. Time moved slowly inside the ark. Animals stirred within their chambers while weary breaths echoed through the dim corridors of wood and shadow. Then one morning, sunlight pierced the clouds for the first time since the storm began. Golden light spilled across the waters while distant mountain peaks slowly emerged above the horizon. Hope awakened again within the hearts of Noah's family. A raven was released into the skies, followed later by a dove that eventually returned carrying an olive leaf in its beak, a sign that life had begun returning to the earth. When the waters finally receded, the ark rested upon dry ground beneath clear heavens washed clean by judgment. Noah stepped outside into cool morning air, carrying the scent of wet soil and fresh rain. Silence covered the renewed earth. No cities remained. No voices echoed across the valleys. Humanity stood once more at a beginning, just as Adam and Eve once had after leaving Eden. Yet the scars of sin still remained within the human heart, waiting silently beneath the surface of generations yet unborn. The renewed earth stretched quietly beneath wide blue skies as Noah and his family stepped into a world washed clean by the flood. Morning sunlight shimmered across wet valleys where fresh rivers carved paths through untouched soil. Mist drifted between distant mountains while birds crossed the open heavens above landscapes emptied by judgment. Noah built an altar upon the ground and offered sacrifice before God, smoke rising slowly into the calm air beneath the light of dawn. The Creator established a covenant with humanity, placing a rainbow across the clouds as a sign that the earth would never again be destroyed by floodwaters. For a moment, peace seemed to rest upon creation once more. Yet deep within mankind, the wound born in Eden still endured. Generations multiplied again across the earth. Families spread into distant lands beyond the mountains and rivers, while cities slowly rose from the wilderness. Human ambition returned alongside human growth. Men sought greatness for themselves rather than reverence toward heaven. Eventually, they gathered together upon a vast plain beneath scorching sunlight and decided to build a city with a tower reaching toward the heavens themselves. The structure rose higher with each passing season. Massive stones dragged upward through dust-filled streets crowded with workers shouting beneath the blazing sky. The Tower of Babel became a monument to pride, humanity once again attempting to exalt itself above God. But the Creator descended upon the city and shattered its unity. Languages divided suddenly among the people. Confusion spread like fire through the crowds as neighbors could no longer understand one another's words. Fear and chaos erupted beneath the unfinished tower, while nations scattered across the earth carrying different tongues and cultures into distant regions of the world. Humanity had once again fractured beneath the consequences of pride. Yet even amid mankind's rebellion, the promise spoken after Eden still remained alive within history. Through generations hidden among ordinary lives, God continued preparing a future redemption not yet visible to the broken world wandering farther from paradise, with every passing century beneath the endless skies of time. Centuries unfolded like drifting sands across the earth, while kingdoms rose and vanished beneath the weight of time. Nations spread through deserts, forests, and mountain valleys carrying their own languages, customs, and ambitions into the expanding world. Wars erupted between rulers hungry for power while idols carved from stone and gold filled temples crowded with smoke and ritual fire. Humanity searched endlessly for meaning, yet remained separated from the Creator by the shadow, firstborn in Eden. Still, among the countless generations moving across history, God chose one man through whom a greater promise would continue. His name was Abram. He lived beneath the wide skies of Mesopotamia, where caravans crossed endless deserts carrying spices, livestock, and woven cloth between ancient cities surrounded by towering walls. Abram was already old when the voice of God called him away from his homeland into an unknown future. One evening he stood outside his tent beneath a sky overflowing with stars brighter than scattered fire across the heavens. Cool desert winds moved through the camp, while distant sheep bells echoed across the silent hills. Then the Lord spoke, promising that Abram's descendants would become as numerous as the stars above him, and that through his lineage all nations of the earth would one day be blessed. Abram believed, though the promise seemed impossible. His wife Sarai remained barren, and age had already bent their bodies beneath the passing years. Yet faith carried Abram forward into lands unknown. He journeyed through scorching deserts and rocky valleys guided only by divine promise beneath endless skies. Campfires flickered through the nights, while distant wolves cried beyond the darkness surrounding his tents. The ancient longing for restoration, the longing born when Adam and Eve lost Eden, still echoed through humanity's story, though few fully understood it. God changed Abram's name to Abraham and Sarai's to Sarah, sealing a covenant that would shape generations far beyond their understanding. Through their lineage, history itself moved slowly toward a future redemption prepared since the earliest moments after humanity's fall beneath the forbidden tree in the garden long ago. Night settled softly over Abraham's camp beneath a canopy of stars stretching endlessly across the desert heavens. Fires crackled between the tents while servants and shepherds rested after long journeys through barren lands shaped by wind and time. Abraham sat quietly beside the fading flames, his weathered face illuminated by flickering light as he reflected upon the impossible promises spoken by God. Though decades had passed since leaving his homeland, Sarah still remained without child. The ache of unanswered longing lingered within their hearts like a silent wound carried through the years. Yet the Lord had not forgotten his covenant. One evening, as warm winds drifted across the camp carrying the scent of dry earth and distant rain, mysterious visitors approached Abraham beneath the great trees near his dwelling. Their presence carried unusual authority, and heaven itself seemed near as they spoke. They declared that Sarah would bear a son despite her old age. Hidden inside the tent, Sarah listened in disbelief and laughed quietly to herself, overwhelmed by the impossibility of such words. But nothing remained impossible before the Creator who once formed mankind from dust and breathed life into clay. In time, the promise was fulfilled. Isaac was born beneath skies filled with celebration and tears of joy long delayed. Abraham held the child in trembling arms while dawn lights spread across the hills surrounding the camp. Hope, covenant, and future generations now rested within this single life. Yet faith would soon be tested in ways deeper than human understanding. Years later, God commanded Abraham to journey to Mount Moriah and offer Isaac as sacrifice. The command pierced Abraham's soul like a blade hidden within darkness. Still he obeyed. Father and son climbed the mountain together beneath cold morning winds while silence weighed heavily between them. Isaac carried the wood upon his back, unaware of the terrible purpose awaiting them above. At the summit, Abraham raised the knife with trembling hands beneath the silent heavens. Then the voice of God stopped him. A ram appeared caught within nearby thorns, provided as sacrifice in Isaac's place. Mercy triumphed where death had seemed certain, foreshadowing a redemption far greater than humanity yet understood. Generations flowed onward like rivers through the unfolding wilderness of history. Isaac grew old beneath the blessing carried from Abraham, and his sons inherited both promise and division within their hearts. Among them was Jacob, a man shaped by struggle, longing, and restless ambition. He wandered beneath desert skies, carrying the weight of conflict between himself and his brother Esau, whose anger burned fiercely after Jacob claimed the blessing of their father through deception. One night, exhausted from fleeing across barren lands, Jacob rested alone upon the cold earth with only stones beneath his head and the endless heavens above him. Winds moved softly across the hills while distant jackals cried beneath the darkness. As sleep overtook him, a vision unfolded unlike anything mortal eyes had witnessed before. A ladder stretched from the earth into the very heights of heaven itself, and angels moved upon it like streams of living light ascending and descending between worlds. Above the ladder stood God, repeating the covenant first spoken to Abraham, promising land, descendants, and future blessing that would reach beyond generations yet unborn. Jacob awoke trembling beneath the dawn, overwhelmed by the sacred presence surrounding him. He named the place Bethel, for he believed he had stood near the gateway of heaven itself. Yet the years ahead would continue shaping him through hardship and endurance. Jacob labored many seasons beneath scorching heat and freezing nights to marry Rachel, the woman he loved deeply, while betrayal and rivalry wounded his household with sorrow and jealousy. Children were born, tribes emerged, and the family through whom God's covenant moved steadily forward continued multiplying beneath the changing skies of the ancient world. One son among them would alter the destiny of nations. His name was Joseph, beloved by Jacob beyond all others. Joseph's dreams spoke of future greatness, but those dreams awakened envy within the hearts of his brothers like hidden fire waiting for destruction. The shadow of human sin, first awakened in Eden and deepened through generations, still lingered within mankind. Yet beyond betrayal, suffering, and human weakness, heaven continued weaving a greater purpose through history with patient and unstoppable design. Joseph walked through the hills of Canaan beneath bright morning skies, while his brothers watched him with growing resentment hidden behind hardened expressions. His robe, woven with many colors by Jacob's loving hands, moved in the warm desert wind as a visible reminder of the favor placed upon him above the others. Yet it was not merely the robe that fueled their hatred. Joseph spoke openly of dreams in which the sun, moon, and stars bowed before him, dreams that seemed to proclaim authority over his own family. Around evening fires beneath the open heavens, his brothers whispered bitterly among themselves while jealousy deepened like poison in the darkness. One day Jacob sent Joseph to search for his brothers' grazing flocks far across the wilderness. Dust swirled beneath Joseph's sandals as he journeyed through rocky valleys beneath the burning sun. When his brothers saw him approaching in the distance, anger consumed them. Their hatred erupted into violence beneath the silent skies. They seized Joseph, stripped away the robe their father had given him, and cast him into a deep, empty pit where shadows swallowed the young dreamer beneath the earth. Above him, his brothers debated his fate while cold stones surrounded him in suffocating darkness. Eventually, merchants traveling toward Egypt passed through the wilderness, their camels carrying spices and goods beneath clouds of drifting dust. Joseph was pulled from the pit and sold into slavery for pieces of silver, his cries fading behind the caravan as it disappeared across the horizon. Back home, his brothers stained the colorful robe with blood and presented it to Jacob, allowing the grieving father to believe wild beasts had devoured his beloved son. Jacob's cries of anguish echoed through the camp beneath storm-darkened skies, while Joseph journeyed farther from home into an unknown future. Chains weighed heavily upon him as Egypt's towering cities emerged beyond the desert sands, filled with temples, palaces, and monuments rising beneath the blazing sun. Though abandoned by his brothers and torn from everything familiar, Joseph could not yet see that the suffering surrounding him would become part of a divine purpose unfolding far beyond human understanding or imagination. Egypt rose from the desert like a kingdom carved from sunlight and stone. Towering monuments cast long shadows across the bustling streets, while the Nile flowed through the land like a living artery, sustaining endless fields of grain beneath the burning sky. Joseph entered this foreign world not as a prince or honored guest, but as a slave bound in chains beneath the authority of strangers. The language around him sounded unfamiliar. The smell of incense drifted from towering temples where priests bowed before carved idols of gold and granite. Far from the tents of his father and the hills of Canaan, Joseph faced loneliness deeper than words could carry. Yet even within suffering, the presence of God remained near him. Joseph served faithfully in the household of Potiphar, an Egyptian official of great power. Over time, his diligence and wisdom earned trust within the house, and responsibility was placed into his hands. But darkness soon rose again against him. Potiphar's wife falsely accused Joseph after he resisted her temptation, and the young Hebrew was thrown into prison beneath the hardened stone of Egypt's underground cells. Iron doors slammed shut around him, while torchlight flickered against damp walls carrying the scent of mildew and despair. Years passed slowly within the prison darkness. Yet Joseph did not surrender to bitterness. He interpreted dreams for fellow prisoners through insight granted by God, though at first his gift seemed forgotten beneath silence and waiting. Then one night Pharaoh himself was troubled by terrifying visions no wise man in Egypt could explain. He dreamed of 7 healthy cattle devoured by 7 gaunt beasts, and of full grain consumed by withered stalks beneath scorching wind. Joseph was summoned from the prison chambers into the royal courts. Standing before Pharaoh beneath towering pillars and blazing torches, Joseph revealed that 7 years of abundance would be followed by 7 years of devastating famine across the earth. Pharaoh recognized divine wisdom within him and elevated Joseph to authority over Egypt itself. The slave betrayed by his brothers now stood second only to the ruler of the greatest kingdom upon earth. Beyond the palace walls, the first signs of drought already stirred across distant lands, and destiny quietly moved toward a reunion shaped by sorrow, forgiveness, and the unseen guidance of heaven. The famine spread across nations with merciless force. Crops withered beneath scorching winds while rivers shrank beneath relentless heat. Villages emptied as desperate families searched for food across barren lands where dust storms swept through dying fields beneath cloudless skies. Yet in Egypt, grain remained stored within vast chambers prepared under Joseph's wisdom during the years of abundance. Caravans arrived from distant kingdoms carrying starving travelers toward Pharaoh's land of survival. Among those travelers came Joseph's brothers, journeying from Canaan beneath exhaustion and desperation. Their faces were aged by hardship and time, yet Joseph recognized them immediately when they entered the great halls of Egypt seeking grain. They bowed before him without realizing the ruler standing above them was the brother they had once sold into slavery. The dreams of Joseph's youth unfolded silently before his eyes beneath the towering pillars of Pharaoh's court. Yet Joseph did not reveal himself at once. Pain from betrayal still lingered deep within his memory like wounds never fully healed. He tested his brothers, observing whether the cruelty once hidden in their hearts still remained. Fear and uncertainty filled them as Joseph questioned them sternly through interpreters while guards watched beneath flickering torchlight. Back in Canaan, Jacob waited anxiously beside fading fires, believing he had already lost Joseph forever. Eventually Joseph could restrain himself no longer. In a private chamber away from Egyptian eyes, emotion overwhelmed him like floodwaters breaking through a dam held too long. Tears streamed down his face as he revealed his identity to the stunned men standing before him. Silence filled the room heavier than thunder. The brothers trembled with fear, expecting judgment for the terrible evil they had committed years before. Yet Joseph spoke words shaped not by revenge, but by mercy. He declared that though they intended harm, God had used their actions to preserve life during the famine consuming the world. Reconciliation slowly replaced fear as tears, sorrow, and forgiveness flowed together beneath the palace shadows. Soon Jacob himself journeyed into Egypt, where father and son embraced after decades of grief and separation. In the midst of famine and suffering, God had preserved the covenant lineage once again, guiding history forward through pain toward purposes still hidden beyond the horizon of time. Years passed beneath the blazing skies of Egypt as the descendants of Jacob multiplied across the fertile lands near the Nile. Children filled the settlements of the Hebrews while shepherds guided flocks through green fields nourished by the river's endless waters. The memory of Joseph's wisdom slowly faded from the minds of Egypt's rulers, replaced by fear toward the growing strength of the foreign people living within their borders. A new pharaoh arose who did not remember Joseph or the salvation he had once brought during the years of famine. Suspicion hardened the king's heart as he looked upon the multiplying Hebrews and imagined rebellion rising against his throne. Soon oppression descended upon the people like iron chains tightening across generations. Hebrew men labored beneath scorching sunlight, constructing massive cities and monuments for Egypt's glory, while overseers shouted commands through clouds of dust and sweat. Whips cracked across weary backs as slaves carried stone beneath unbearable heat. Their cries rose into the heavens day and night, while the Nile flowed silently beside the suffering of God's people. Pharaoh's fear grew so great that he ordered every newborn Hebrew son cast into the river to die. Mothers wept beside the waters while soldiers marched through settlements beneath torchlight, searching for infants marked for death. Yet amid the darkness, one child was hidden by his mother within a small basket coated in pitch and placed among the reeds beside the Nile. Morning mist drifted above the river while the child's soft cries echoed faintly through the reeds. Pharaoh's daughter discovered the basket while bathing beside the water and took pity upon the infant. The child was named Moses, meaning drawn from the water. Raised within Egypt's royal courts, Moses grew surrounded by wealth, towering temples, and royal power while never fully belonging to the kingdom that sheltered him. He walked marble halls beneath golden banners and towering statues, yet deep within him remained the knowledge that he was Hebrew, connected to the enslaved people suffering beyond the palace walls. As years unfolded, the cries of Israel continued rising toward heaven beneath the burden of slavery. And beyond the visible struggles of mankind, God was preparing Moses for a moment that would ignite deliverance and shake the mighty empire of Egypt itself. Moses grew into manhood beneath the grandeur of Pharaoh's palace, where polished stone halls echoed with the footsteps of priests, servants, and royal guards. Golden torchlight flickered across towering statues of Egyptian gods, while incense drifted through chambers filled with wealth beyond imagination. Yet despite the luxury surrounding him, Moses carried unrest within his soul. He watched Hebrew slaves labor beneath the burning sun, their backs scarred by whips and their voices filled with exhaustion. The suffering of his people stirred something fierce within him that palace comfort could never silence. One day Moses witnessed an Egyptian overseer brutally beating a Hebrew slave among the construction fields. Dust swirled violently through the air while the slave collapsed beneath the blows. Anger erupted within Moses like fire unleashed after years of restraint. Looking around and seeing no witnesses nearby, he struck down the Egyptian and buried the body beneath the sand. But the secret did not remain hidden. Word spread quickly through Egypt, and Pharaoh sought Moses' death. Forced to flee into the wilderness, Moses abandoned the palaces of Egypt and disappeared into the barren deserts beyond civilization. The wilderness stretched endlessly before him beneath scorching sunlight and freezing nights filled with silence. Years passed as Moses became a shepherd in the land of Midian, guiding flocks through rocky valleys where winds howled across empty mountains beneath endless skies. The prince of Egypt had become a wanderer shaped by solitude and hardship. Then one day, while leading sheep near Mount Horeb, Moses witnessed something impossible. A bush burned upon the mountainside, yet the flames did not consume it. Fire danced among the branches while the desert winds moved around the strange and holy sight. As Moses approached, the voice of God called out from the fire itself, commanding him to remove his sandals because the ground beneath him had become sacred. Fear gripped Moses as he stood trembling before divine presence hidden within the flames. God declared that he had heard the cries of Israel beneath Egyptian slavery and would now send Moses back to Pharaoh as deliverer. The shepherd who once fled in fear now stood chosen for a purpose that would alter the destiny of nations. Beyond the mountains, Egypt still slept beneath the illusion of power, unaware that heaven itself was preparing to confront its kingdom through signs, judgment, and liberation. The deserts of Midian faded behind Moses as he journeyed back toward Egypt, carrying the weight of divine command upon his shoulders. Sandstorms swept across the wilderness while cold nights stretched beneath stars burning like ancient fire above the earth. Fear wrestled within him during every step toward the kingdom he had once fled. He remembered Pharaoh's wrath, the towering palaces, and the blood buried beneath Egyptian sand decades earlier. Yet the voice from the burning bush still echoed within his spirit with undeniable authority. Beside him traveled Aaron, his brother, sent by God to stand with him before the ruler of Egypt. At last the massive cities of Pharaoh rose beyond the horizon once more, crowned with obelisks, temples, and monuments celebrating human power beneath the blazing sun. Moses entered the royal courts not as a prince returning home, but as a messenger of heaven carrying judgment upon a kingdom built through oppression and pride. Torchlight illuminated the vast throne room where Pharaoh sat surrounded by guards, priests, and symbols of divine kingship carved into stone. Moses spoke boldly before the ruler, commanding him in the name of God to release the Hebrew people from slavery. Pharaoh's face hardened with arrogance and fury. He mocked the command and refused to acknowledge the God of Israel. Instead of freedom, he increased the suffering of the Hebrews, forcing them to labor harder beneath unbearable burdens. Their cries filled the settlements as despair spread among the people Moses had come to save. Yet heaven's judgment had already begun moving against Egypt. The Nile turned to blood beneath darkened skies, while fish floated lifeless upon the crimson waters. Frogs swarmed the land in endless waves. Gnats and flies consumed homes and marketplaces. Livestock perished. Boils covered the skin of Egypt's people. Hailstorms shattered crops beneath violent thunder and fire falling from the heavens. Locusts devoured what remained of the land while darkness swallowed Egypt for 3 terrifying days, thick as death itself. Still Pharaoh resisted, his heart growing colder beneath every plague. The tension between heaven and Egypt intensified like a storm nearing its final explosion. One final judgment remained, a night of sorrow so devastating that its memory would echo through history for generations beyond counting. Silence settled over Egypt like a shadow before death. The streets of great cities stood strangely still beneath moonless skies while cold winds drifted through palace corridors and narrow village paths alike. Moses moved among the Hebrew settlements carrying urgent instructions from God. Each family was commanded to sacrifice a spotless lamb and mark the doorposts of their homes with its blood. Inside the houses, firelight flickered against trembling faces while families gathered together in fearful expectation. Bread baked quickly without yeast. Cloaks were fastened tightly. Sandals remained upon weary feet as though the people stood ready to flee at any moment into the unknown darkness beyond their doors. Outside, Egypt rested beneath terrifying stillness, unaware that judgment was descending upon the land. Midnight arrived. Then death moved through Egypt like unseen wind sweeping across the nation. From Pharaoh's palace to the poorest dwelling, cries erupted into the night as the firstborn in every Egyptian household perished beneath the hand of divine judgment. The sound of mourning echoed through streets, temples, and royal chambers beneath skies blackened by grief. Pharaoh himself collapsed beneath the agony of losing his own son, the heir to Egypt's throne. The mighty empire that once mocked heaven now trembled beneath unbearable sorrow. At last Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron before dawn, his voice broken with defeat as he commanded the Hebrews to leave Egypt immediately. The people departed in haste beneath pale morning light, while smoke still rose from Egyptian homes filled with mourning. Thousands moved across the desert carrying children, livestock, and the remains of generations shaped by slavery. Tears streamed down weathered faces as chains of oppression finally broke beneath the power of God. Yet freedom came shadowed by uncertainty. Ahead stretched endless wilderness beneath scorching skies. Behind them remained Pharaoh, whose pride would soon rise again like a storm refusing to die. As Israel journeyed farther from Egypt, dust rising beneath countless footsteps, distant thunder echoed across the horizon. The final confrontation between Pharaoh and the people of God had not yet ended. Before them lay the waters of the Red Sea, vast and impossible beneath the blazing light of dawn. The Red Sea stretched before Israel like an endless barrier beneath the fierce light of dawn. Waves crashed against the shoreline while sharp winds carried salt through the air across the crowded camp of exhausted refugees. Behind them rose clouds of dust darkening the horizon, Pharaoh's army advancing with chariots, horses, and soldiers hungry for vengeance. Panic spread rapidly among the people. Mothers clutched children close while terrified voices cried through the camp accusing Moses of leading them into death. The thunder of approaching chariots echoed louder with every passing moment. Trapped between the sea and the army of Egypt, the Hebrews stood on the edge of destruction beneath burning skies. Yet Moses remained still before the waters, gripping the staff given to him by God, while violent winds whipped his robe through the air. Then the command of heaven came. Moses stretched out his hand above the sea, and suddenly the east wind roared across the waters with supernatural force. The sea began to divide. Walls of water rose towering on both sides while the seabed emerged beneath swirling mist and moonlit spray. Fear turned to stunned silence across the camp as a path opened through the heart of the sea itself. The people moved forward into the impossible corridor while winds screamed around them and waves crashed like mountains held back by invisible power. Torchlight flickered across frightened faces as families hurried through the depths beneath the hand of God. Behind them, Pharaoh's army charged recklessly into the divided sea, chariot wheels grinding against the wet earth while soldiers shouted through the storm. But when the last of Israel reached the opposite shore, Moses raised his staff once more. The walls of water collapsed with terrifying force upon the Egyptians. Waves consumed horses, soldiers, and chariots beneath thunderous torrents that shook the earth itself. Morning sunlight revealed bodies and shattered weapons scattered along the shoreline, while the sea returned to peaceful rhythm as though nothing had happened. On the far shore, Israel stood trembling with awe beneath the dawn sky, watching the destruction of the empire that had enslaved them for generations. Songs of deliverance rose into the morning air, while Miriam danced beside the waters with joy. Yet beyond the celebration stretched the vast wilderness ahead, a harsh journey that would test faith, obedience, and the fragile hearts of humanity once again. The wilderness stretched endlessly before Israel beneath scorching skies and merciless winds. Sand and stone covered the horizon in every direction while the sun burned fiercely above the wandering nation, moving slowly through barren valleys and jagged mountains. By day, clouds of dust rose beneath countless footsteps. By night, cold darkness settled across the camp, while distant wolves cried beyond the firelight. Though the people had witnessed miracles beyond imagination at the Red Sea, fear and doubt quickly returned within their hearts. Hunger spread through the camp as supplies diminished beneath the relentless journey. Voices of complaint rose against Moses, while memories of Egypt, twisted by desperation, began appearing preferable to the uncertainty of freedom. Yet God provided manna from heaven each morning, covering the ground like frost beneath the dawn. The people gathered the mysterious bread while sunlight spilled across the wilderness hills. Water also flowed from barren rock when Moses struck it with his staff before the thirsty multitudes. Even amid rebellion and fear, divine mercy continued sustaining them through the harsh desert path. Then Israel arrived at Mount Sinai, where thunderclouds gathered above the towering mountain like a living storm descending from heaven itself. Lightning split the skies while the earth trembled beneath deafening thunder. Trumpet blasts echoed through the wilderness, though no human hands sounded them. Fear gripped the people as the presence of God descended upon the mountain in fire and smoke. Moses climbed into the darkness covering Sinai, while the nation waited below in trembling silence. There upon the mountain, God gave the commandments that would shape Israel as a people set apart from the nations surrounding them. Stone tablets were written by divine authority, revealing laws of holiness, justice, and covenant. Yet while Moses remained upon the mountain, impatience consumed the camp below. The people demanded visible gods to lead them, and a golden calf was forged from melted jewelry beneath dancing firelight and reckless celebration. When Moses descended carrying the sacred tablets, sorrow and anger overwhelmed him at the sight of Israel's rebellion so soon after witnessing heaven's power. The covenant had barely been spoken before human weakness once again revealed itself beneath the shadow, firstborn in Eden. Still, God did not abandon his people. Through judgment, mercy, and enduring patience, he continued guiding them toward the land promised generations earlier to Abraham beneath the stars. Years passed beneath the relentless skies of the wilderness as Israel wandered through deserts shaped by heat, silence, and stone. Entire generations rose and faded beneath the endless journey while tents stretched across valleys like scattered shadows beneath the blazing sun. Children were born who had never seen Egypt, never felt the sting of a slave master's whip, yet still carried within them the fear and rebellion passed through human hearts since Eden. Moses led the people faithfully despite exhaustion and sorrow weighing heavily upon him. Again and again he stood between Israel and divine judgment as complaints echoed through the camp like bitter wind. Some longed to return to Egypt. Others doubted the promises of God whenever hardship appeared before them. Yet through every trial, the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night continued guiding the nation through the barren wilderness. Eventually, the people reached the borders of the promised land. 12 spies crossed into Canaan beneath golden sunlight, exploring valleys overflowing with vineyards, rivers, and fertile fields. The land was beautiful beyond expectation, yet fear consumed most of the spies when they saw fortified cities and powerful warriors dwelling there. Their fearful report spread panic throughout the camp like wildfire beneath storm-darkened skies. Only Joshua and Caleb urged the people to trust the power of God, but the nation chose fear over faith. Because of their rebellion, Israel was condemned to wander the wilderness until the unbelieving generation passed away beneath the sands of time. Decades later, as Moses stood upon Mount Nebo overlooking the promised land from afar. Cool winds moved through his silvered hair, while evening sunlight covered the hills of Canaan in gold. The land stretched before him like a dream long pursued, yet never fully reached. Moses had carried the burden of leadership through suffering, miracles, rebellion, and divine encounters beyond human understanding. Yet he would not enter the land himself. His journey ended upon the mountain beneath the quiet gaze of heaven. Alone with God, Moses breathed his final breath while the fading light of sunset touched the earth below. Israel mourned him deeply beside the Jordan River as the wilderness winds carried sorrow through the camp. But the covenant journey continued onward through Joshua, and the story of humanity's longing for restoration pressed steadily forward beneath the unfolding hand of God. The waters of the Jordan River surged beneath the light of dawn as Israel prepared to enter the land promised generations earlier to Abraham. Priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant stepped carefully toward the rushing waters, while thousands stood watching in breathless silence beneath the cool morning air. Then, as the priest's feet touched the river's edge, the waters stopped flowing. The river parted before the people just as the Red Sea had done decades earlier beneath Moses. Israel crossed into Canaan upon dry ground, while sunlight broke across the hills beyond, illuminating the land their ancestors had longed to see through centuries of wandering and suffering. Yet entering the land did not bring immediate peace. Fortified cities stood before them, with towering walls and armies prepared for war. The first obstacle was Jericho, its massive walls rising above the plains like an unbreakable fortress beneath the desert sky. Joshua obeyed the strange command given by God. For 6 days, Israel marched silently around the city while priests sounded trumpets that echoed across the valley beneath burning sunlight. The people spoke no word. Dust rose beneath thousands of footsteps while the inhabitants of Jericho watched from above with fear and confusion. On the 7th day, the nation circled the city 7 times beneath gathering tension thick as storm clouds before thunder. Then the trumpets sounded louder than before, and Israel shouted with one united voice that shook the valley itself. The walls of Jericho collapsed violently beneath divine power, sending clouds of stone and dust exploding into the air. The city fell, and Israel advanced deeper into the promised land through battles, victories, and painful failures shaped by obedience or rebellion toward God. Over time, tribes settled across valleys, hills, and fertile plains beneath the changing seasons of Canaan. Vineyards flourished where wilderness once stretched untouched. Children played beside rivers promised to their ancestors centuries earlier beneath foreign stars. Yet even within the blessing of the land, Israel struggled repeatedly with idolatry, pride, and disobedience. Human hearts remained fragile and divided despite miracles, covenants, and divine guidance. The longing for true restoration still lingered unresolved beneath the surface of history, waiting for a redemption greater than kingdoms, victories, or earthly inheritance alone could ever provide. After Joshua's death, Israel entered an age of uncertainty beneath skies shadowed by conflict and spiritual decline. Tribes settled across the land but often stood divided, each pursuing its own desires without unity or lasting faithfulness toward God. Idolatry spread quietly through villages and cities as foreign gods were worshipped beneath sacred groves and carved altars stained with smoke and blood. Whenever the people abandoned the covenant, oppression followed swiftly. Enemy nations invaded the land, raiding settlements and crushing Israel beneath violence and fear. Then, in desperation, the people cried out to God for deliverance, and he raised judges to rescue them from destruction. Warriors, prophets, and unlikely leaders emerged during these troubled generations, each carrying the burden of guiding a rebellious nation through cycles of suffering and restoration. Among them rose Samson, a man of extraordinary strength whose life reflected both divine purpose and human weakness. From birth he had been set apart under a sacred vow, his uncut hair symbolizing dedication to God. Samson tore lions apart with his bare hands and struck down enemies with terrifying power beneath storm-filled skies and blazing battlefields. Yet desire and pride slowly led him toward ruin. Delilah, whose beauty concealed betrayal, uncovered the secret of his strength while Samson slept with his head upon her lap beneath flickering lamplight. His hair was cut, his strength vanished. Philistine soldiers seized him, gouging out his eyes before dragging him into chains beneath mocking crowds. Darkness consumed the once mighty warrior as he ground grain like a slave within enemy prisons. Yet in his final moments, standing between the towering pillars of a Philistine temple crowded with laughing rulers and drunken celebration, Samson prayed one final prayer for strength. With trembling arms he pushed against the pillars while thunderous cracks echoed through the structure. The temple collapsed violently upon itself, burying enemies and Samson alike beneath stone and dust. Even through brokenness and failure, God continued working through flawed humanity to preserve his people. Still, the deeper problem remained unresolved. Israel needed more than temporary deliverers. The nation longed for a righteous king who could lead with justice, faithfulness, and wisdom beneath the gaze of heaven itself. The tribes of Israel gathered beneath restless skies, demanding a king like the nations surrounding them. Though God had guided his people through prophets and judges, they longed for earthly power visible before human eyes. The prophet Samuel, aged and weary from years of leadership, warned them solemnly beneath the evening winds that kings could bring oppression, war, and suffering. Yet the people refused to listen. Their desire for a ruler burned stronger than their trust in divine guidance. So God allowed Israel to receive what it demanded. Saul was chosen as the first king, a tall and commanding warrior whose appearance inspired confidence among the people. At first he ruled with humility, leading Israel into battle against its enemies beneath banners waving across dusty battlefields. Victories brought celebration through the nation while songs echoed around evening fires praising the strength of their king. But pride slowly poisoned Saul's heart. Fear of losing power consumed him until disobedience and jealousy overshadowed his once noble beginnings. The Spirit of God departed from Saul, and darkness settled upon his reign like gathering storm clouds before destruction. Then, in quiet contrast to the king seated upon Israel's throne, God chose another leader hidden among shepherd fields and rolling hills. David was the youngest son of Jesse, overlooked by men yet seen clearly by heaven. He spent his days guiding sheep through valleys beneath open skies while playing melodies upon a harp beside flickering campfires at night. Lions and bears threatened the flock, yet David defended them fearlessly beneath moonlit wilderness and roaring storms. His heart carried humility and devotion unlike the pride-consuming Saul. One day Samuel traveled secretly to Bethlehem and anointed David with oil before his family, though none yet understood the destiny resting upon the young shepherd's shoulders. Meanwhile, war threatened Israel from the Philistines, whose champion Goliath stood like a giant upon the battlefield mocking the armies of God. Fear gripped Israel's soldiers as the enormous warrior roared challenges across the valley day after day beneath the blazing sun. Yet from among trembling armies would rise the shepherd boy whose faith would shake kingdoms and reveal once more that heaven's strength often moves through those the world least expects. The valley of Elah stretched beneath the fierce heat of afternoon sunlight, while two armies faced one another across the rocky terrain. Dust swirled beneath the feet of soldiers standing frozen with fear as Goliath emerged once again from the Philistine ranks. The giant towered above ordinary men like a moving fortress clad in bronze armor that glimmered beneath the blazing sky. His voice thundered across the valley, mocking Israel and challenging any warrior brave enough to face him in combat. Yet no man stepped forward. Fear spread through Israel's camp like cold poison despite the weapons and shields surrounding them. Then David arrived carrying supplies for his older brothers serving in Saul's army. The young shepherd listened as Goliath hurled insults against the living God, and righteous anger rose within him stronger than fear itself. While seasoned soldiers trembled, David declared that the same God who delivered him from lions and bears would also deliver this giant into his hands. Saul reluctantly allowed the shepherd boy to fight, though the king himself doubted such a victory possible. David rejected heavy armor and weapons unfamiliar to him. Instead, he carried only his sling, staff, and 5 smooth stones gathered from the brook flowing quietly through the valley. As David walked toward Goliath beneath the burning sun, the giant laughed with contempt at the sight of the unarmed youth approaching him. But David answered boldly that the battle belonged not to human strength, but to the Lord of hosts. Then the moment came. David placed a stone into his sling and released it with swift precision. The stone struck Goliath directly upon the forehead with devastating force. The giant staggered before collapsing to the earth like thunder, shaking the valley floor. Silence gripped both armies for one breathless moment before Israel erupted into victorious cries echoing across the battlefield. The Philistines fled in terror, while David stood over the fallen giant beneath skies blazing with triumph. From that day forward, songs spread throughout Israel praising the shepherd who defeated the impossible enemy through faith rather than earthly might. Yet the victory awakened jealousy within Saul's darkened heart. The king who once ruled with honor now saw David not as servant or hero, but as a threat to his throne. And so began years of pursuit, betrayal, and suffering that would shape David into the king Israel desperately needed. Saul's jealousy grew like consuming fire within the halls of his palace. Torches flickered against stone walls while whispers of David's victories spread throughout Israel, fueling the king's fear with every passing day. Songs celebrating the young warrior echoed through villages and marketplaces beneath the evening skies, declaring that David had slain greater numbers than Saul himself. What began as insecurity soon hardened into deadly hatred. Again and again Saul attempted to kill David, hurling spears through the royal chambers while rage twisted his once noble spirit into darkness. David fled into the wilderness where caves, mountains, and barren valleys became his refuge beneath the vast heavens. Loyal men gathered around him, warriors, outcasts, and wanderers drawn toward the future king despite the dangers surrounding him. Nights in the wilderness were cold and silent except for crackling fires and distant animal cries echoing through the hills. David often looked toward the stars remembering the promises of God, while fear and uncertainty battled within his heart. More than once Saul pursued him with armed soldiers through rocky deserts and shadowed caves. Yet even when opportunities arose for David to strike down the king, he refused to shed Saul's blood, honoring the authority once established by God despite the suffering Saul caused him. Years passed beneath hardship and wandering until finally battle erupted between Israel and the Philistines upon Mount Gilboa. The clash thundered across the mountains beneath darkened skies, while arrows rained upon Israel's soldiers like deadly storms. Saul and his sons fell in battle, and the kingdom descended into mourning beneath the heavy shadow of loss. David wept deeply when news reached him, lamenting not only Saul but also Jonathan, Saul's son and David's closest friend, whose loyalty had remained steadfast through every danger. Eventually, David was crowned king over Israel. Trumpets sounded through Jerusalem while crowds gathered beneath golden sunlight, celebrating the shepherd who had become ruler of the nation. Under David's leadership, Jerusalem became the heart of Israel, and the Ark of the Covenant was brought into the city with dancing, music, and joyful celebration. Yet though David loved God deeply, he remained human, vulnerable to temptation, weakness, and grievous sin that would bring sorrow into both his household and the kingdom he ruled beneath the gaze of heaven. Jerusalem flourished beneath David's reign as songs of worship echoed through its streets and marketplaces crowded with merchants, shepherds, and travelers from distant lands. The city rested upon the hills like a crown beneath the golden light of sunset, while Israel experienced peace and strength unmatched in generations. Yet amid prosperity and victory, danger arose not from foreign armies, but from the hidden weaknesses within the human heart. One evening, while warm winds drifted across the rooftops of Jerusalem, David walked upon the palace terraces overlooking the city below. Torchlight flickered through distant homes, while silence settled beneath the deepening night sky. Then David saw Bathsheba bathing nearby, her beauty illuminated by soft moonlight and the glow of nearby lamps. Desire overtook wisdom within the king's heart. Though Bathsheba belonged to another man, Uriah, a loyal soldier fighting in David's army, the king summoned her into the palace. What began in secret soon spiraled into betrayal and death. When Bathsheba became pregnant, David attempted to conceal his sin by recalling Uriah from battle. Yet Uriah's loyalty prevented him from enjoying comfort, while fellow soldiers still fought and suffered at war. Desperation drove David deeper into darkness. He ordered Uriah placed at the front lines of battle where fighting was fiercest, then abandoned by fellow soldiers so death would surely claim him. Uriah fell beneath enemy swords while the king remained within palace walls. For a time David believed his actions hidden, but nothing remains concealed before heaven. The prophet Nathan came before the king beneath solemn silence and spoke a parable exposing David's guilt like light, revealing corruption buried within darkness. Conviction shattered David's heart as he realized the depth of his sin before God. Though forgiveness was granted through mercy, consequences followed relentlessly into David's household. Violence, rebellion, and grief entered his family like storms breaking through weakened walls. One son violated another's sister. Another son, Absalom, rose in rebellion against his own father, leading civil war through the streets and hills of Israel. David fled Jerusalem barefoot and weeping while betrayal spread through the kingdom he had built. The man after God's own heart learned painfully that even the greatest among humanity remained marked by the brokenness born in Eden. Yet through judgment and mercy alike, God's covenant promise continued moving forward through David's lineage toward a future king unlike any the world had ever known. The warnings of the prophets echoed through Israel and Judah like thunder rolling across distant mountains before a devastating storm. Yet kings hardened their hearts while priests corrupted sacred worship, and the people continued bowing before idols carved from stone and wood. Violence filled the streets of the cities while injustice consumed the weak beneath the greed of the powerful. Prophets such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel stood before rulers and crowds alike, declaring that judgment was no longer distant. Foreign empires were rising beneath heaven's permission, prepared to discipline the covenant people for generations of rebellion. Still, many mocked the warnings, believing Jerusalem's walls and the temple itself guaranteed safety forever. But the shadow of destruction drew nearer with every passing year. Soon the armies of Babylon marched across the land like an unstoppable flood. Their banners darkened the horizon while war drums echoed through valleys and fortified cities trembling beneath siege. Smoke rose from burning towns as refugees fled through the countryside, carrying children and fragments of shattered lives beneath ash-filled skies. Jerusalem itself became surrounded by enemy forces. Hunger consumed the city during the siege while fear spread through crowded streets where desperation replaced hope. Mothers wept beside empty marketplaces. Soldiers weakened upon the walls beneath relentless assault. Then at last the defenses collapsed. Babylonian armies stormed Jerusalem with swords and fire. The temple built by Solomon, once radiant with gold and sacred glory, burned beneath roaring flames that illuminated the night sky with terrifying brilliance. Priests and civilians alike cried out in horror as the holy city was destroyed stone by stone. Survivors were chained and led away into exile across endless desert roads toward Babylon, while smoke continued rising behind them from the ruins of Jerusalem. The people sat weeping beside foreign rivers beneath unfamiliar stars, remembering Zion and the covenant land they had lost through rebellion. Yet even amid judgment, God did not abandon his promise. Prophets spoke of future restoration beyond exile, of hearts one day renewed rather than merely restrained by law. They spoke of a coming servant who would bear suffering for others and establish peace unlike earthly kingdoms ever could. Though darkness covered the nation and exile shattered their identity, hope still flickered quietly beneath the ashes of judgment, like embers refusing to die beneath cold and endless night. Babylon towered above the plains with walls so vast they seemed to challenge the heavens themselves. Massive gates covered in brilliant blue stone shimmered beneath the desert sun, while idols of gold and bronze filled temples crowded with incense and pagan ritual. Into this foreign empire the exiles of Judah were brought in chains, their hearts heavy with grief for the homeland left behind in ruins. Among the captives was Daniel, a young man carried away from Jerusalem during the early waves of conquest. Though surrounded by wealth, power, and constant pressure to abandon his faith, Daniel remained steadfast before God within the courts of Babylon. He served foreign kings with wisdom and integrity that soon distinguished him above others. Yet danger followed faithfulness in a kingdom shaped by pride and human ambition. One night, King Nebuchadnezzar dreamed troubling visions no wise man could explain. Fear spread through the royal palace beneath flickering torchlight, while execution threatened every counselor in Babylon. Daniel sought mercy from God through prayer, and during the silence of night the mystery was revealed to him. Standing before the king beneath towering pillars and golden statues, Daniel interpreted the dream, declaring that earthly kingdoms would rise and fall beneath the sovereignty of heaven. Nebuchadnezzar, though mighty, ruled only by permission granted from above. Time passed, and pride eventually consumed the king himself until God humbled him through madness and isolation beneath the open skies. Yet Babylon's arrogance did not end with Nebuchadnezzar. Years later, another ruler held a lavish feast using sacred vessels stolen from Jerusalem's temple, while drunken celebration echoed through palace halls illuminated by firelight and laughter. Suddenly, a mysterious hand appeared, writing words of judgment upon the wall before terrified nobles frozen in silence. Daniel alone understood the meaning. Babylon's kingdom had been weighed and found wanting before God. That very night the empire fell beneath invading armies while the city's rulers perished amid chaos and fear. Through shifting kingdoms and collapsing empires, Daniel remained faithful. Even when enemies conspired against him and he was thrown into a den of lions beneath the darkness of night, God preserved him unharmed. Dawn revealed Daniel standing alive among the silent beasts while sunlight streamed into the stone chamber. Earthly kingdoms continued rising and crumbling beneath time's relentless passage, but the promises of God endured beyond every empire built by human hands. The years of exile stretched across generations like a long and sorrowful winter beneath foreign skies. Children were born in Babylon who had never seen Jerusalem, yet stories of Zion still lived within the songs and prayers of the exiled people. Elders spoke quietly beside evening fires of the temple that once stood upon the holy mountain, of sacrifices rising toward heaven, and of festivals celebrated beneath the presence of God. Though sorrow remained heavy upon them, hope slowly awakened through the promises spoken by the prophets. Jeremiah had declared that exile would not last forever. Ezekiel had seen visions of restoration beyond the valley of dry bones. Isaiah had spoken of comfort, redemption, and a future king who would establish everlasting peace. Then, in the unfolding movement of history directed by unseen hands, the Persian Empire conquered Babylon beneath the rule of King Cyrus. Unlike the rulers before him, Cyrus issued a decree allowing the Jewish exiles to return to their homeland and rebuild the Temple of God in Jerusalem. The news spread through the exiled communities like dawn breaking after endless darkness. Tears filled the eyes of the elderly who had believed they would die far from home. Families gathered possessions while caravans formed beneath the open desert sky, preparing for the long journey back to Judah. The road home was difficult and scarred by memory. Ruined villages and broken fields greeted the returning exiles as they approached Jerusalem for the first time in generations. The city remained shattered beneath the consequences of past rebellion. Burned stones lay scattered where walls once stood strong. Foxes wandered among the ruins of the Temple Mount beneath cold winds and silent skies. Yet amid devastation, determination rose within the people. They cleared rubble with weary hands while priests rebuilt the altar and sacrifices resumed upon the sacred ground once more. Tears and songs mingled together as foundations for a new temple were laid beneath the light of sunrise. Though smaller and less glorious than Solomon's temple had been, it stood as a sign that God had not abandoned his covenant people. The exile had disciplined them, but mercy still endured. Yet even after returning to the land, the deeper problem within humanity remained unresolved. Sin still wounded the heart. Nations still warred beneath pride and violence. The longing for final redemption, the promise whispered since Eden, continued waiting beneath the unfolding story of the world. Centuries moved forward like shifting shadows beneath the hand of time. Empires continued rising and collapsing across the earth while the descendants of Israel lived under the authority of foreign rulers, Persians, Greeks, and eventually Romans whose legions marched across nations beneath banners of iron and blood. Jerusalem endured through changing powers, its temple standing once more upon the holy hill while priests carried out sacred rituals day after day beneath the smoke of sacrifices. Yet beneath outward worship, many hearts remained burdened by weariness, longing, and spiritual hunger. The promises spoken by the prophets still echoed through the generations. People waited for the Anointed One, the Messiah who would restore Israel, defeat evil, and establish the kingdom of God upon the earth. During these centuries, silence seemed to settle between heaven and mankind. Prophets no longer arose with thunderous declarations as before. Yet beneath the silence, history moved steadily toward a moment prepared since the earliest days after humanity's fall in Eden. Far from palaces and royal courts, in the humble town of Nazareth, a young woman named Mary lived quietly beneath the ordinary rhythms of village life. She carried water through narrow streets beneath the warm light of Galilean mornings, while Roman soldiers patrolled distant roads, reminding Israel daily of foreign oppression. One evening, as shadows lengthened across the hills and lamps flickered softly within simple homes, an angel appeared before Mary with radiant glory that pierced the stillness like lightning through darkness. Fear gripped her heart as the messenger declared that she had found favor with God and would bear a son unlike any before him. This child would be called the Son of the Most High, inheriting the throne promised to David generations earlier. Though Mary struggled to comprehend the mystery unfolding before her, she surrendered humbly to the will of God despite the uncertainty surrounding her future. Soon whispers spread through Nazareth as Mary's pregnancy became visible before her marriage to Joseph was complete. Shame and misunderstanding threatened her life and reputation. Yet Joseph himself received divine reassurance through dreams beneath the silence of night. Together they prepared for the birth of the promised child while the world around them remained unaware that heaven's long-awaited redemption was drawing near beneath ordinary skies and unnoticed stars. A decree from Caesar Augustus spread across the Roman Empire commanding people to return to their ancestral towns for registration. Roads filled with travelers journeying beneath winter skies while merchants, soldiers, and weary families crossed valleys and deserts crowded with movement and noise. Joseph and Mary traveled south toward Bethlehem, the city of David, though Mary neared the time of childbirth. Cold winds swept across the Judean hills as they arrived among overflowing crowds gathered within the small town. Lanterns flickered through narrow streets packed with strangers seeking shelter from the bitter night air. Yet no room remained for them within the inns crowded by travelers. At last they found refuge within a humble shelter where animals rested beneath the scent of hay and earth. There, far from royal palaces or earthly glory, the child promised through generations was born into the world. Mary wrapped the newborn in cloths and laid him within a manger while silence covered the night beyond the stable walls. Outside Bethlehem, shepherds watched their flocks upon lonely hills beneath the vast darkness of the heavens. Fires crackled softly against the cold, while sheep rested quietly among the rocky fields. Suddenly the night exploded with radiant light brighter than dawn itself. Angels appeared filling the sky with terrifying glory as the shepherds fell trembling upon the ground. The heavenly messengers proclaimed good news of great joy. A Savior had been born, Christ the Lord. Multitudes of angels filled the heavens, singing praises while the hills echoed with worship unlike anything mortal ears had ever heard. The shepherds hurried toward Bethlehem, guided by wonder and trembling hope. They found the child lying within the manger exactly as heaven had declared. Nearby, the night remained still beneath countless stars shining over the quiet town, unaware of the miracle hidden within its humble streets. Wise men from distant lands would later journey following a mysterious star blazing across the heavens, bringing gifts fit for a king. Yet even at his birth, danger already stirred. King Herod, consumed by fear of losing power, sought to destroy the child through violence and bloodshed. The story begun in Eden, carried through generations of exile, kings, prophets, and promises, had now entered its most sacred chapter. Heaven itself had stepped into humanity's broken world through the fragile form of a child born beneath the cold silence of Bethlehem's night. The child Jesus grew quietly beneath the humble rhythms of life in Nazareth, a small village surrounded by rolling hills, olive groves, and dusty roads traveled by merchants and Roman soldiers alike. Morning sunlight spilled across stone houses while carpenters shaped wood beneath the sound of hammer strikes echoing through the narrow streets. Joseph taught Jesus the craft of working with timber and tools while Mary treasured within her heart the mysterious events surrounding his birth. Though outwardly ordinary, the child carried within him the fulfillment of promises spoken across centuries. At 12 years old, Jesus journeyed with his family to Jerusalem during the Passover feast. Crowds filled the city beneath blazing sunlight while priests carried sacrifices through the temple courts alive with voices, prayer, and smoke rising toward heaven. After the festival ended, Mary and Joseph began the return journey home, believing Jesus traveled among relatives and friends. But as evening approached beneath cooling skies, fear seized them when they realized he was missing. For 3 agonizing days they searched through Jerusalem's crowded streets and marketplaces before finally finding him within the temple itself. There Jesus sat among the teachers of the law, listening and speaking with wisdom that astonished the learned men surrounding him. Even as a child, authority and understanding flowed from him unlike anything ordinary humanity possessed. Years passed quietly after this moment. Jesus continued growing in wisdom, stature, and favor before both God and man, while the world around him remained largely unaware of who he truly was. Meanwhile, Israel groaned beneath Roman occupation. Soldiers marched through villages enforcing imperial rule, while heavy taxes burdened the poor. Many longed desperately for the coming Messiah who would overthrow oppression and restore the kingdom promised to David. Yet few imagined the redemption God prepared would arrive not through armies or earthly conquest, but through sacrifice, truth, and divine mercy. Then, when the appointed time approached, a voice began crying out from the wilderness beside the Jordan River. John the Baptist, clothed in camel's hair and hardened by desert life, called the people to repentance beneath open skies and flowing waters. Crowds gathered from across the land listening to his fiery warnings and baptisms of preparation. The ancient silence between prophecy and fulfillment had ended. Beneath the windswept wilderness and the watchful heavens above, the moment long awaited since Eden was about to unfold before the eyes of mankind. Jesus returned from the wilderness carrying quiet authority that spread through Galilee like fire awakening across dry fields. Villages stirred with whispers about the teacher from Nazareth whose words pierced hearts and whose presence carried unusual power. He walked dusty roads beneath open skies surrounded by fishermen, laborers, the poor, and those rejected by society. Along the shores of the Sea of Galilee, morning mist drifted above the waters while fishing boats rocked gently against the tide. There Jesus called ordinary men to follow him, Simon Peter, Andrew, James, and John leaving behind nets, boats, and familiar lives beneath the sound of gulls crying over the water. They followed him without fully understanding the path ahead. Crowds soon gathered wherever Jesus traveled. The sick were carried through narrow streets upon woven mats, while blind men cried out beside the roads for mercy. Lepers, outcasts forbidden from ordinary human contact, approached trembling with desperate hope in their eyes. Jesus touched them without fear, and disease vanished beneath his compassion. Storms calmed when he spoke over raging seas beneath blackened skies and crashing waves. Demons fled screaming from tormented souls. The lame stood and walked. The blind opened their eyes to sunlight for the first time. Everywhere he went, astonishment followed like thunder after lightning. Yet beyond miracles, it was his words that unsettled hearts most deeply. Upon hillsides overlooking Galilee, Jesus taught the crowds about the kingdom of God. Warm winds moved through the grass while thousands listened in complete silence beneath the open heavens. He spoke of loving enemies, forgiving sins, and caring for the poor. He declared that the meek, the merciful, and the pure in heart were blessed before God. Unlike religious leaders burdening people with pride and legalism, Jesus spoke with compassion and authority flowing directly from heaven itself. Yet not everyone welcomed him. Religious authorities watched with growing suspicion as his influence spread across the land. Crowds hailed him as prophet, healer, even Messiah, while priests and Pharisees feared losing power and control. Beneath outward tension, unseen spiritual conflict intensified around him. Humanity stood face to face with the fulfillment of promises whispered since Eden. Yet many hearts remained blind despite the miracles unfolding before their eyes beneath the sunlit skies of Galilee. As Jesus continued traveling through towns and wilderness paths across Israel, the crowds surrounding him grew larger with every passing season. People came carrying every kind of suffering beneath the weight of broken lives. The blind led by trembling hands, the crippled lowered through crowded doorways, grieving mothers clutching dying children against their chests. Dust filled the air as thousands pressed near him along narrow roads beneath blazing sunlight. Yet no sorrow seemed hidden from his eyes. He fed multitudes in deserted places with only a few loaves and fish, while evening winds swept across the grassy hillsides beside the sea. The people sat in astonished silence watching baskets overflow with abundance impossible to explain. Still many followed him only for miracles or earthly hope, longing for liberation from Roman rule rather than understanding the deeper redemption he came to bring. One evening Jesus led his disciples across the Sea of Galilee while storm clouds gathered suddenly over the darkening waters. Furious winds crashed against the boat, waves spilling over the sides as terrified disciples struggled against the storm beneath flashes of lightning. Yet Jesus slept peacefully amid the chaos. Desperate cries awakened him, and he stood before the raging sea speaking only a few words. Instantly the winds ceased. The waters became still beneath the moonlit sky. Fear and wonder gripped the disciples as they whispered among themselves, asking what kind of man could command even the storm itself. Yet despite witnessing miracles beyond human understanding, they still struggled to grasp who truly stood among them. Jesus often withdrew alone into mountains and wilderness places to pray beneath silent stars and cold night winds. The burden he carried stretched far beyond the expectations of the crowds following him. He knew suffering awaited him in Jerusalem, where religious leaders increasingly plotted against him beneath the shadows of growing hatred and fear. Still he continued teaching with unwavering compassion. He spoke in parables of lost sheep, prodigal sons, hidden treasure, and seeds falling upon different soils. Stories simple enough for children, yet carrying truths deep enough to pierce eternity itself. Around him the tension between light and darkness intensified steadily. The kingdom of God had drawn near through his presence, yet human pride, fear, and unbelief continued resisting the very salvation heaven had prepared since the beginning of the world. The road toward Jerusalem wound through rocky hills beneath the golden light of approaching Passover season. Pilgrims filled the paths traveling toward the holy city with songs, sacrifices, and expectation rising in their hearts. Among them walked Jesus and his disciples, though an unusual heaviness lingered beneath the surface of the journey. Again and again Jesus spoke privately to his followers about suffering, rejection, and death awaiting him in Jerusalem. Yet they struggled to understand words so opposite from their hopes of earthly triumph. They still imagined crowns, victory, and liberation from Rome rather than betrayal and sacrifice. As Jerusalem finally appeared upon the horizon crowned by the shining Temple Mount, Jesus paused, overlooking the city beneath the fading sunlight. Tears filled his eyes as he wept for the people who could not recognize the peace standing before them. Soon crowds gathered, waving palm branches and shouting praises as Jesus entered the city riding humbly upon a donkey. The streets echoed with celebration while cloaks covered the road before him beneath the warm spring air. Many believed the promised king had finally arrived to establish his kingdom through power and conquest. Yet within the temple courts, religious leaders watched with growing fury. Merchants sold animals and exchanged money beneath sacred arches where prayer should have risen before God. Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers, coins scattering across the stone floors while his voice thundered through the temple, declaring that his Father's house had become corrupted. Tension erupted openly after that day. Priests, Pharisees, and rulers sought opportunities to trap him through questions and accusations, but his wisdom continually silenced them before the crowds. Meanwhile, Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples, allowed greed and disillusionment to harden his heart beneath the growing shadow surrounding Jerusalem. Secret meetings unfolded beneath torchlit chambers as religious leaders arranged betrayal for 30 pieces of silver. The city remained alive with Passover celebration, while unseen darkness closed steadily around Jesus, like storm clouds gathering before nightfall. The story begun beneath Eden's forbidden tree had reached the threshold of its most painful and sacred moment. Soon betrayal, suffering, and sacrifice would unfold beneath the same heavens where humanity had once fallen so long ago. Night settled over Jerusalem beneath a sky crowded with silent stars, while Passover lamps flickered throughout the city's narrow streets. Within an upper room prepared quietly away from the crowds, Jesus gathered with his disciples for the final meal before suffering would descend upon him. The atmosphere carried strange tension beneath the warm glow of oil lamps and the distant sounds of celebration echoing beyond the windows. The disciples spoke softly among themselves, unaware that the hours ahead would shatter everything they believed secure. Jesus moved among them with solemn calm, knowing betrayal already sat beside him at the table. Then, in an act that stunned every man present, he wrapped a towel around himself and knelt to wash the dust-covered feet of his disciples like a servant beneath flickering firelight. Peter protested in confusion, unable to bear seeing his master stoop so low. Yet Jesus spoke gently of cleansing deeper than water upon the skin. During the meal, he broke bread and lifted the cup, declaring that his body would soon be broken and his blood poured out for many. The words settled heavily upon the room like approaching thunder. Judas slipped quietly into the darkness beyond the doorway after receiving the bread from Jesus' hand, and the night itself seemed colder after his departure. Later they crossed the Kidron Valley beneath silver moonlight toward the Garden of Gethsemane, where ancient olive trees twisted beneath the night wind. There Jesus withdrew to pray while his disciples, overcome by exhaustion and sorrow, struggled to remain awake. Alone among the trees, Jesus fell to the ground beneath unbearable anguish. Sweat like drops of blood formed upon his face as he prayed to the Father, asking if the cup of suffering might pass from him, yet surrendering fully to divine will above human fear. The silence of the garden was broken suddenly by the glow of torches approaching through the darkness. Judas returned leading soldiers and temple guards armed with swords and clubs. With a kiss upon Jesus' cheek, betrayal was sealed beneath the ancient trees. The disciples scattered in terror as soldiers seized Jesus and dragged him away through the sleeping city. Above Jerusalem, the night sky remained silent, while humanity moved closer than ever before to the moment that would alter eternity itself. The streets of Jerusalem echoed with hurried footsteps and clashing armor as Jesus was led through the darkness from one trial to another beneath the cold hours before dawn. Torchlight flickered against stone walls while priests and religious leaders gathered within shadowed chambers, seeking justification to condemn him. False witnesses spoke conflicting accusations filled with bitterness and lies. Yet Jesus answered little before them. His silence unsettled the council more deeply than angry resistance ever could. When the high priest demanded to know whether he claimed to be the Son of God, Jesus answered with calm authority that they would one day see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. Outrage erupted through the chamber. Robes were torn. Voices shouted condemnation while guards struck Jesus across the face beneath mocking laughter. Meanwhile, outside in the cold courtyard below, Peter lingered near the firelight watching events unfold from a fearful distance. 3 times people recognized him as one of Jesus' followers, and 3 times Peter denied even knowing him. Then a rooster crowed through the gray silence before sunrise. Jesus turned and looked toward Peter across the courtyard, and the disciple fled into the darkness, weeping bitterly beneath crushing shame. At dawn, Jesus was brought before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor whose authority alone could order execution. Pilate questioned him carefully beneath the imposing halls of Roman power, sensing no true crime deserving death. Yet the crowd, stirred by religious leaders, demanded crucifixion with growing fury. Outside the palace, voices roared beneath the morning sky, while tension filled Jerusalem like a storm ready to break. Pilate offered to release Jesus, but the people instead demanded freedom for Barabbas, a known criminal. Fear of unrest and political consequence overcame justice within Pilate's heart. He symbolically washed his hands before the crowd while sentencing Jesus to death by crucifixion. Roman soldiers dragged him away into the fortress courtyard where brutality descended without mercy. They stripped him, scourged him with whips tearing flesh from his body, and forced a crown of thorns upon his head while blood streamed down his face beneath cruel mockery. The king long promised through generations now stood beaten and rejected by the very world he came to save. Morning light spread across Jerusalem while Jesus staggered through the crowded streets carrying the heavy wooden cross upon torn and bleeding shoulders. Roman soldiers forced him forward beneath shouts, mockery, and the crushing weight of exhaustion. Blood stained the stones beneath his feet, while women wept openly among the crowds lining the narrow roads. The city, alive with Passover celebrations, scarcely understood the eternal significance of the suffering unfolding before its eyes. Jesus stumbled repeatedly beneath the burden of the cross until a man named Simon of Cyrene was compelled to help carry it through the rising heat of the day. Beyond the city walls stood Golgotha, the place of the skull, a barren hill where executions were carried out beneath the open heavens. There the soldiers stretched Jesus upon the wooden beams while iron nails pierced his hands and feet with horrifying violence. The sound of hammer strikes echoed through the air as the cross was lifted upright against the darkening sky. Above his head the inscription read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." Crowds gathered beneath the cross, some mocking, others mourning in stunned silence. Religious leaders ridiculed him openly, demanding that he save himself if he truly possessed divine power. Yet Jesus answered not with curses, but with mercy, praying for forgiveness even for those crucifying him. Beside him hung criminals condemned to die, and one turned toward Jesus in desperate faith during his final moments. Jesus promised him paradise beyond death itself. As hours passed, darkness spread unnaturally across the land, though it was midday. Winds howled across the hill while the earth seemed to groan beneath the weight of the moment unfolding upon the cross. Jesus cried out in agony, bearing not only physical torment, but the crushing burden of humanity's sin and separation from God stretching back to Eden itself. At last, with one final breath, he declared, "It is finished." Then his head fell forward beneath the storm-darkened sky. The earth shook violently. Rocks split apart. Within the temple, the massive veil separating the holy place was torn from top to bottom. Even hardened Roman soldiers standing beneath the cross trembled with fear, declaring surely this man had been the Son of God. Humanity's deepest wound had met heaven's greatest act of sacrifice upon that lonely hill outside Jerusalem. Darkness lingered heavily over Jerusalem after the crucifixion as cold winds swept through the streets beneath skies bruised by storm clouds and grief. The crowds that had once shouted for Jesus' death dispersed slowly into uneasy silence, while fear settled over his followers like suffocating shadow. Joseph of Arimathea, a respected council member who secretly believed in Jesus, approached Pilate requesting permission to bury the body before the Sabbath began. Together with Nicodemus, he wrapped Jesus in linen cloths scented with myrrh and aloes beneath the fading light of evening. They carried him to a nearby garden tomb carved into stone where silence echoed beneath the cool earth and ancient olive trees swayed softly in the wind. A massive stone was rolled across the entrance while Roman guards were stationed nearby to prevent any disturbance or theft of the body. Night descended fully upon Jerusalem. The disciples hid behind locked doors, consumed by fear, confusion, and despair. Everything they had believed about the Messiah seemed shattered beneath the cross. Peter sat broken beneath the memory of his denials while tears and shame haunted him through the endless darkness. The women who had followed Jesus from Galilee mourned quietly beside flickering lamps, preparing spices for burial rites once the Sabbath passed. Throughout the city, whispers spread among the people, some disturbed by the darkness and earthquake that accompanied the crucifixion, others satisfied believing the troublesome teacher from Nazareth had finally been silenced. Yet beneath the stillness of the sealed tomb, unseen victory had already begun moving against death itself. The powers of darkness that entered the world through humanity's fall believed the story had ended at Golgotha. But heaven's purpose reached deeper than the grave. Dawn slowly approached after the long silence of the Sabbath night. Cool mist drifted through the gardens outside Jerusalem, while the first faint light touched the horizon beyond the sleeping city. The women walked quietly toward the tomb, carrying burial spices beneath trembling hearts and weary sorrow. None of them knew that history itself stood on the edge of its greatest miracle, the moment when death would lose its final hold, and the promise whispered since Eden would burst forth victorious beneath the rising sun. The first rays of dawn pierced the darkness beyond Jerusalem, while mist clung to the gardens outside the city walls. Birds stirred softly among the olive branches as the women approached the tomb, carrying spices in trembling hands. Grief weighed heavily upon them with every step across the dew-covered ground. They wondered anxiously who might move the massive stone sealing the entrance. Yet when they arrived, fear seized them instantly. The stone had already been rolled away. The earth itself bore signs of violent disturbance, while Roman guards lay scattered in terror like men struck lifeless by overwhelming power. The women stepped cautiously toward the open tomb beneath the pale light of morning and found it empty. Linen burial cloths rested folded within the silence of the chamber, but the body of Jesus was gone. Suddenly, radiant figures appeared beside them, shining with glory brighter than sunlight. The women fell trembling to the ground as the heavenly messengers spoke words that would echo through eternity itself. "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen." Shock and wonder overwhelmed them like floodwaters breaking through sorrow long held within the soul. They fled from the tomb breathless with fear and joy, carrying the impossible news to the disciples hiding within Jerusalem. At first, the men struggled to believe such words could be true. Yet Peter and John raced through the awakening streets toward the garden tomb beneath the growing light of dawn. Entering the empty chamber, they found only the burial cloths remaining in solemn silence. Confusion filled them, yet hope flickered where despair had once consumed every thought. Then Jesus himself began appearing alive to his followers. Mary Magdalene encountered him first within the garden, mistaking him through her tears for a gardener until he gently spoke her name. Later, he walked beside two disciples traveling the road to Emmaus beneath the evening sky, revealing himself through the breaking of bread. Fearful disciples hiding behind locked doors suddenly stood face to face with the risen Christ as he appeared among them, speaking peace into their terror. The grave had been conquered. Death itself had been overcome. The curse unleashed through humanity's rebellion in Eden had met its answer through the resurrection of the one who carried divine mercy into the brokenness of the world. For 40 days after his resurrection, Jesus appeared repeatedly to his followers across Jerusalem, Galilee, and the surrounding countryside beneath changing skies and restless winds. The disciples who once hid in fear behind locked doors were transformed by encounters with the risen Christ, whose presence shattered every certainty about death itself. Along the shores of Galilee, morning mist drifted across quiet waters while fishermen cast empty nets beneath pale dawn light. Then from the shoreline came a familiar voice calling them to cast the nets once more. The catch overflowed instantly with fish, and recognition flooded Peter's heart like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He leapt into the water and rushed toward Jesus, standing beside a small fire where bread and fish warmed beneath the rising morning sky. There, beside crackling flames and gentle waves washing against the shore, Jesus restored Peter after his terrible denials. 3 times he asked whether Peter loved him, healing shame through mercy deeper than failure itself. On another mountain in Galilee, hundreds gathered around the risen Lord while winds swept through the grass beneath wide blue heavens. Jesus spoke of authority given to him over heaven and earth and commanded his followers to carry the message of salvation to all nations. The frightened disciples who once scattered in Gethsemane now listened with growing courage as they realized the kingdom of God would extend far beyond Israel into the entire world. Yet the time soon came for Jesus to depart physically from among them. He led his followers to the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, where evening sunlight bathed the hills in gold. There he blessed them while speaking final words of promise and instruction. Then, before their astonished eyes, Jesus ascended upward as clouds surrounded him beneath the radiant sky. The disciples stood watching in awe until angels appeared declaring that he would one day return in glory just as they had seen him depart. Jerusalem remained beneath Roman occupation. The world still groaned beneath violence, corruption, and death. Yet something irreversible had begun. Humanity no longer stood abandoned beneath the curse born in Eden. Through the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, Heaven had opened a path toward reconciliation, redemption, and eternal hope for all who would believe beneath the unfolding story of generations yet to come. After the ascension of Jesus, the disciples returned to Jerusalem carrying both uncertainty and burning expectation within their hearts. They gathered together in prayer within upper rooms lit by flickering lamps while the city outside continued moving through ordinary rhythms beneath Roman rule. Pilgrims crowded the streets during feast days while priests continued sacrifices at the temple, unaware that a new covenant had already begun through the risen Christ. Then came the day of Pentecost. Morning sunlight illuminated the city while thousands gathered from distant nations speaking many different languages beneath the bustling sounds of celebration and trade. Suddenly a sound like a violent rushing wind filled the house where the disciples prayed. The noise thundered through the chambers with supernatural force, while flames like tongues of fire appeared resting upon each of them. Fear gave way to overwhelming boldness as the Spirit of God filled those who once trembled before earthly powers. The disciples poured into the streets proclaiming the works of God in languages they had never learned. Crowds gathered in astonishment, hearing the message spoken clearly in their own tongues by ordinary Galilean men. Some stood amazed while others mocked, accusing them of drunkenness beneath the blazing midday sun. Then Peter stepped forward before the multitude. The fisherman who once denied Jesus beside a courtyard fire now spoke with fearless authority before thousands. He declared that Jesus, crucified and risen, was both Lord and Messiah. Conviction swept through the crowd like a mighty wave beneath the open heavens. Thousands believed and were baptized that very day, while the early community of believers formed in Jerusalem through prayer, fellowship, generosity, and worship. Yet opposition soon rose fiercely against them. Religious authorities arrested disciples, threatened violence, and sought to silence the growing movement proclaiming resurrection and salvation through Christ alone. Some believers were beaten, others imprisoned. Still, the message continued spreading through cities, villages, and distant lands with unstoppable force. Even persecution became fuel carrying the gospel farther across the world. The story that began with Adam and Eve in Eden, with exile, covenant, kings, prophets, and sacrifice, now moved outward toward all nations beneath heaven. Humanity's hope no longer rested upon earthly kingdoms, temples, or human strength, but upon the risen Savior whose victory over death promised restoration deeper than anything the world had ever known. Persecution intensified against the followers of Christ as the message of resurrection spread through Jerusalem and beyond. Religious leaders, threatened by the growing movement, sought to crush it before it transformed the nation entirely. Among those opposing the believers stood Saul of Tarsus, a zealous Pharisee whose devotion to religious law burned fiercely within him. He watched approvingly as Stephen, one of the first followers of Christ, was stoned to death outside Jerusalem beneath a storm of flying rocks and furious voices. Stephen's final prayers for forgiveness echoed beneath the darkening sky, even as blood stained the earth around him. Saul carried letters authorizing the arrest of believers and traveled toward Damascus breathing threats and violence against the growing church. Yet along the lonely road beneath the scorching midday sun, heaven intervened suddenly and powerfully. A brilliant light brighter than the desert sky surrounded Saul, casting him to the ground while a voice called out to him directly, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Trembling and blinded by the overwhelming encounter, Saul asked who spoke to him. The answer shattered his understanding completely. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Led helpless and sightless into Damascus, Saul remained in darkness for 3 days, wrestling with the revelation that the crucified Jesus truly lived. Then a disciple named Ananias, though fearful at first, obeyed God and prayed for Saul. Something like scales fell from Saul's eyes, and his sight returned. The persecutor became a believer, transformed by divine mercy. Soon Saul, later called Paul, began proclaiming Christ boldly in synagogues and cities across the Roman world. He traveled through dangerous seas, hostile towns, deserts, prisons, and violent persecution, carrying the gospel into lands far beyond Israel. Roman roads stretched beneath his weary feet, while storms battered ships crossing dark waters beneath thunder-filled skies. Again and again Paul suffered imprisonment, beatings, hunger, and rejection, yet the message continued spreading through every hardship. Churches formed in distant cities among Jews and Gentiles alike as people from every background discovered hope through Christ. The redemption promised since Eden was now reaching outward into the nations, inviting humanity back toward restored relationship with the Creator through grace stronger than sin, death, or human failure. Years passed as the message of Christ spread steadily across the Roman Empire through persecution, sacrifice, and unwavering faith. Believers gathered secretly within homes, caves, and hidden chambers illuminated by oil lamps, while outside the machinery of empire continued ruling through military power and fear. Roman authorities often viewed the growing movement as dangerous because Christians refused to worship emperors as gods or bow before pagan idols. Arrests increased. Families were separated. Some believers faced execution within arenas where crowds roared beneath towering stone walls stained by violence and bloodshed. Yet even in suffering, their faith burned with extraordinary courage that astonished the watching world. Elderly apostles who had once walked beside Jesus carried the gospel into old age despite constant danger surrounding them. Peter eventually traveled to Rome itself, where persecution under Emperor Nero erupted with terrifying cruelty after a devastating fire consumed portions of the city. Christians became scapegoats for the empire's rage. Many were tortured or killed beneath the shadow of Roman power. According to tradition, Peter faced execution by crucifixion, yet requested to be crucified upside down, believing himself unworthy to die in the same manner as Christ. Paul also suffered imprisonment within Rome's cold stone prisons before eventually facing execution beneath imperial authority. Yet even as these witnesses died, the message they carried continued spreading beyond anything earthly rulers could contain. The Apostle John, exiled to the island of Patmos beneath lonely skies and crashing waves, received visions of the future while isolated from the churches he loved. There, amid rocky shores and the sound of relentless seas, heaven revealed glimpses of final judgment, cosmic conflict, and ultimate restoration beyond human history itself. John saw visions of a new heaven and new earth where death, sorrow, and suffering would finally end forever. He saw the holy city descending radiant with divine glory, where God would dwell fully among redeemed humanity once more. The exile begun when Adam and Eve left Eden would one day be completely reversed. The river of life would flow again. The curse would be broken. Creation itself would be restored beneath eternal peace. Through centuries of pain, rebellion, covenant, sacrifice, and redemption, heaven's purpose had moved steadily toward this final promise, the restoration of all things beneath the reign of the eternal King. The story of humanity began in a garden filled with beauty untouched by death. Warm rivers flowed beneath trees heavy with life, while Adam and Eve walked openly with God beneath the gentle light of creation's first mornings. Yet within that paradise came the choice that fractured the harmony between heaven and mankind. Fear entered where innocence once lived. Exile replaced peace. From that moment onward, every generation carried the wound born beneath the forbidden tree. Kingdoms rose through pride and violence. Empires collapsed beneath corruption and judgment. Prophets wept. Kings failed. Humanity searched endlessly for restoration, yet could never heal itself completely. Still, through every age of suffering and rebellion, God continued weaving redemption through history with patient and unwavering mercy. The cries of slaves in Egypt, the songs of shepherds beneath Bethlehem's stars, the tears shed beside crosses and empty tombs, all move toward the fulfillment of a promise older than the foundations of the world itself. Jesus Christ entered humanity's brokenness not as a distant ruler surrounded by earthly glory, but as the suffering Savior who carried the burden of sin, conquered death, and opened the path back toward eternal life. Through his resurrection, the darkness unleashed in Eden met its ultimate defeat. Yet the story does not end merely in the past. Humanity still walks through a world scarred by sorrow, war, fear, and longing. Every graveyard, every broken heart, every restless soul still bears witness to the lingering consequences of the fall. But beyond the suffering of the present age remains the promise of restoration spoken through prophets, apostles, and the risen Christ himself. One day creation will be renewed. Tears will vanish like mist beneath morning sunlight. Death will lose its final shadow. The exile of humanity will end, and the presence of God will dwell fully among his people once again. Until that day, the ancient longing for Eden continues echoing within the human soul, a longing for peace, forgiveness, belonging, and eternal life. Beneath the endless heavens and the passing centuries of history, the invitation of redemption still remains open. The story that began with Adam and Eve in the garden now reaches toward every heart willing to hear the voice of the Creator calling humanity home beyond the ruins of the fall and into the everlasting light of restoration.